Díomh go léir is mór an ónóir ar an fáilte a chur romh chuig ar géad comhdháil riamh inniu ar lá idirnáisiúnta na Man. Hello everyone, it's my great honour to welcome you all to our inaugural Countess Conference today on International Women's Day. This is a momentous occasion for all of us here in Ireland because this is the first ever gender critical conference to be held in Ireland. It's a very important step forward for the movement, and we are very proud as a group to have put this together only 5 months after we formed. We're here today as a constituency concerned about the impact of gender ideology on our rights and on our freedoms and on the rights and freedoms of our children. By coming together in this way, we are exercising our right to assembly, and our freedom of expression is guaranteed under the Irish Constitution. We're online today because of COVID, but as soon as it's allowed, we will be holding meetings in person. The historical context of our work in Ireland is very dark. We recently had a Mother and Babies Home Commission report, an investigation into 18 of a total of 186 women and mother and baby homes. For 80 out of the 100 years that this state has been in existence, we have incarcerated unmarried mothers, and the babies who survived were sold into labour or adoption, and the ones that died were buried in unmarked graves. That is the historical context of our work. And we at the Countess, we don't buy into the official narrative, which is that those were the dark old days in Ireland, and we now live in a much different era, which is completely different and very progressive. And we don't accept that narrative. We see many parallels of what is happening today. And in fact, we draw a direct line back to that time. You know, back then, women and children were harmed and impacted because of a dominant narrative and a gender and an ideology. And the same thing is happening today. You know, whilst previously we would have virtue signaled for Vatican points, now we're virtue signaling to the world for woke points. So we don't agree with the dominant narrative in this country. And in fact, we would argue that we have unwittingly segued from one theocracy to the next. We used to be ruled by priests, and they dictated our lives. They wrote our laws. In fact, they wrote our constitution. A Jesuit committee wrote the 1937 constitution in Ireland. And the same thing is happening now. You know, the Gender Recognition Act in Ireland and all of the template laws which we face are top-down laws, and we are feeling the impact in everyday life in Ireland of gender ideology. But there is hope. Whilst we may be held up as the poster child of self-ID in the world, the public are becoming aware. The law was brought in 2015. It was brought in by stealth. It was latched on to a much more popular law, marriage equality. But the people are becoming aware through grassroots activism like ours on the ground in Ireland, and all the other groups which really deserve a mention. Women's Space was the first one, Radi Colleen, ourselves, the Countess, the Irish Women's Lobby, and LGBT Alliance Ireland. And together we have all started a conversation here on the ground in Ireland. And as the leaked Denton report shows, these laws are not popular once people actually are allowed to discuss them openly and once they understand what's happening. So our political, and I'm just going to press record actually while I remember, because I realize I haven't, bear with me. And we're going live on Facebook as well to our community on our Facebook page. So our political and media landscape is captured. And what does that mean? What that means really is that the politicians and the journalists in Ireland aren't discussing the dissent. They're only promoting the official narrative. But that will slowly change the more that we raise our voices and make our voices heard. As a group, we feel we have galvanized and we've mobilized a spirit of resistance, much like our figurehead did 100 years ago. A whole new swathe of ordinary people have turned activists. Women who were never political have politicized, and more people are joining us every day from all walks of life. And really our call to action today from today's conference is to get involved. There is no entry requirement. You don't have to be political, you don't have to care about politics, you don't have to be left, you don't have to be schooled in feminism, but you do need to care about the rights and freedoms of women and children. And that is what our work focuses on. And we will always centre women and children in our work. So without further ado, it's my great honour and pleasure to introduce our first panellist. So our first guest is a maths PhD and a statistician and a senior staff writer for The Economist, but she's currently on a sabbatical to write a book on gender ideology, one of the great thought leaders of the movement and someone I've learned so much from. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Helen Joyce.
Well, thank you, Leisha. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm back actually off sabbatical, and the book is now finished. It's being copy edited, and I'll be announcing very, very soon when you can buy it and so on. So I'm really happy to be able to tell you first before anyone else, my own home people, where I'm at on that.
Thanks, Helen. So you're one of the thought leaders in the field. What first made you sit up and pay attention to what was happening, to the impact of gender ideology, and what made you become gender critical as well?
So it's interesting, isn't it? I think for most of us, there's been a narrative all our lives, wherever we are on the political spectrum, there's a narrative that, you know, we're extending rights to more and more new groups. And most of us are very for that. So I think that's been a huge reason why a lot of this has flown under the radar, is that it looks at drive-by speed like it's the next civil rights movement. And I suppose 3 or 4 years ago, before I started to think about it, I didn't think about it much. That's how it would have seemed to me. You know, you had an oppressed minority who had said what they needed for civil rights. I was a bit sort of nervous or suspicious, or something didn't sit right with me as soon as I looked at it a bit more closely than that. And for me, you know, as with a background in mathematics, the sort of central issue for me was this very circular definition, like a woman is anyone who says they're a woman. Something about that bothered me straight away. But it's hard to put your finger on what, isn't it, when everyone around you seems so sure that they've got it right. So I kept sort of nagging away at it. And then I was asked to write an article about it. And mostly I don't write about this for The Economist. I have a quite different job. I'm the deputy foreign editor and haven't written about it for a good while. But it's other people I've written about it for. But anyway, somebody asked me to write about it. And I started to look at it, and I just got actually extremely worried. That was when I started to realize that, you know, they really meant it when they said that saying you're a woman made you a woman. I had sort of assumed it was just a polite fiction, and this is a way of, you know, accommodating people who I'm still really happy to accommodate. You know, if people are really unhappy and people need special accommodations in any society, we can look at that. We can look at ways to do it. There's no reason, blanket reason, that we can't look case by case at different situations and say what's possible. But that wasn't what was being done. What was being made was an ontological claim that what makes you a woman is saying you are a woman. And then, you know, you don't have to be very imaginative to think about the sorts of settings where that's just not going to work out, like prisons, like sports, just like changing rooms, you know. I mean, these things aren't on the basis of what you feel like, they're on the basis of your physicality. And then it seemed extraordinary to me that people hadn't registered that. And then I got quite enraged. And then when I discovered that they were medicalizing children, that was when I really lost the plot completely and decided that I really had to write a book about this.
Now, you're obviously, you were a journalist and are still a journalist. I remember being in journalism school, and been taught that the importance of the fourth estate, that it was imperative that, you know, it was one of the pillars of democracy, and its role was to hold power to account. Now, that might be a little bit idealistic, and probably Noam Chomsky has disproved that. But overall, how do you interpret the role of the media in all of this as a journalist? And also, second part of the question, sorry, the media here in Ireland is sort of fully captured. These issues, the whole issue is treated kind of from the first person in sort of featurey lifestyle stories about trans-identified people, which is all very well, but we need to look at practice and policy. But so how did that happen in the UK? What do you think, when you look back, what helped some brave journalists start to cover this properly in a grown-up way?
So first you have to ask yourself, don't you, why didn't all journalists cover it properly? Like, journalists are meant to, you know, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, and all those sorts of things that journalists say about, you know, news is something that someone somewhere doesn't want me to print. And
Yeah.
it's extraordinary the extent to which journalists have abandoned their traditional practices. And I think you can go back about 20 years and look at the long run history whereby journalism became a graduate subject. And the sorts of subjects that people studied at university were those that have been, in my opinion, corrupted by ideology in the last 20 years. So people study the liberal arts and the humanities and the social sciences, all of which have been hugely captured by a way of thinking that isn't about truth or just concrete reality or practicality, but is incredibly ideological, and that sees words as tools of ideology. So you don't think to yourself, you know, how can I make life better for the sorts of people who are described by words that I've always used in certain ways? You think, how can I change those words to make what I want to happen seem like it's already happened? And they maybe don't put it quite that way, but that is really what they're doing. So journalists changed. They became graduates, they became much more ideological, and then at the same time, money went out of journalism. So there's much less in the way of investigation. A lot of outlets, not the Economist, thankfully, have got rid of older, seasoned reporters. They've brought in younger people that they think will do more digitally. They're looking for more clickbaity type thing because as advertising got lost, people had to try and bring people in. The Guardian, I think in particular, has had a huge issue here in the UK, which is that as it stayed free, its reader base has moved largely to the US. And the US has this extraordinarily polarized political system whereby, you know, everything is right on one side and everything is wrong on the other. And which side is right or wrong just depends on where you sit. So these forces together meant that journalism stopped doing what should have been its job. Now journalism is more a sort of basically a sort of a feel-good propaganda and a way of saying that the world is already what the person who's writing wants it to be, as opposed to actually just reporting what's going on. And then there are all these separate sorts of institutional capture. Like, it is extraordinary that the established women's groups haven't had more to say about all of this, because they're the people who should have pushed back. But that's another part of the story, is that people like Stonewall, like Forces Society here in the UK, see their role in a very different sort of way. They're kind of part of the establishment now. They're not what they used to be. You know, if you think about the way that they got set up, like how Stonewall gets set up, it's very much the way you did. They saw a huge problem, they saw an issue, ordinary people said, I can't let this go, I have to get out there and I have to speak. Well, those people are now comfortable chief executives who, you know, cycle from one charity to another and pat each other on the back and are proud of their institutional capture. They're not people who are driven by a mission anymore. So I will stop in a minute and I'll let you ask me another question, but I do want to say that the thing that makes me most positive about what's happened is the way that I'm seeing this incredible rushing of energy and renewal that's coming out of the stale, you know, capture and, you know, almost corruption, like intellectual corruption of the old order. I really think that we're not going to be able to rescue some of the institutions that should have done this work, but we are going to replace them, and it's things like this that are going to make them be replaced.
Yes, I mean, that reminds me of, like, in Ireland, the official our women's council is now controlled by a male, trans-identified male, you know, pushing that agenda. So yes, I think it's true. These institutions can become like husks compared to what they were set up to do. Can you tell us a bit, in terms of your research and findings, how this came about? It feels like it's come out of nowhere, but obviously this was all put in train, you know, maybe 20 years ago. Can you tell us a bit about that, the sort of meta timeline, if you like?
So I think first off, it's incredibly important not to sound conspiratorial about this. There is no sort of Illuminati behind the scenes that is controlling this. And when we name individual organizations or people, we're not saying, oh, you know, they're sitting there plotting in some sort of seedy way. It's not like that. There's 4 or 5 sort of forces that have converged, and some of them are quite long run. So there's no way that you could have thought of somebody being trans-identified until the doctors started to do operations. And that's pretty much exactly a century ago now, a little bit less than a century. But once that started, you kind of opened a door that could never be closed again, which was that you could change someone's body. Someone could be more than a cross-dresser. So before that, people had cross-dressed, and some people had lived in the opposite sex roles, mostly women, by the way, women who actually wanted the freedoms that they couldn't have as women. So, you know, women went off and fought in the Civil War. You know, James Barry, an Irish woman from Cork, registered in Edinburgh to train as a doctor and then was a doctor for the rest of her life because she couldn't do that as a woman. But when you could start doing operations, and the first ones were all on men, you could imagine something as being beyond cross-dressing. And the doctors had an ideology that was that sex was a spectrum and that you could move people along that sex spectrum. Now, it's nonsense. Sex is not a spectrum. We all know that. Let's not rehearse the ideas. Everyone, you know, here either knows that already or has decided that I'm a massive bigot for saying it, but sex is not a spectrum. It's binary. But that was the way they presented it to their patients. And if you fast forward about 50 years, you've got some transsexuals. And some of those transsexuals are people who have an enormous psychological need not to be seen as living as members of the opposite sex, not to be accommodated, but to be seen as really members of the opposite sex. And because this is such a narrow goal and such a legalistic goal, it looks a bit like a civil rights movement, but actually it's not. So civil rights movements require you to bring everybody, or at least lots of people, with you. You know, women had to persuade men that women deserved the vote, because in the end it was men who had to give it to them. Yes. And black people had to persuade white people that slavery was an abomination, because it was white people who were going to have to end it. Well, you don't have to, if you're someone who's trying to make gender self-identification or some version of that the law, you don't really have to persuade many people, you just have to persuade the legal system. And so actually it's a lobbying movement rather than a civil rights movement. And the urge for it comes from these individuals who very much want to make it happen, some of whom are quite powerful individuals. I mean, they're rich white American men. And some of them are just institutions that were looking for other causes. Mm-hmm. So in particular, when gay marriage was one, it's very important once you become an institutional charity that you've got a new cause. Now, actually, what the gay rights charities should have done is they should have started to worry about countries where we're still hanging and stoning and decapitating gay men. That's what Stonewall should be worrying about. It's just that they happen to be, you know, in Iran or Pakistan. Or we should be worrying about grassroots homophobia. You know, there's so much work that could be done in certain communities in England, but those things don't get you, you know, a baronetcy or lots of money from donors the same way that gay marriage did. So they were looking for another marquee cause, and along came this offer of gender self-identification, and they all pivoted.
And do you feel that Ireland was chosen to become one of the few self-ID nations? I mean, we were the third country after Argentina and Malta, but, you know, from your research, does it feel to you that we were picked out to become sort of the poster child in many ways?
No, not exactly, although you are the poster child. We are the poster child. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Argentina and Malta do not have Ireland's friendly, cuddly, you know, we're nice to everybody sort of image on the global stage. Like, if you wanted one country to do gender self-ID so that you could say everywhere else, you know, Ireland is great, I'm absolutely certain they were trying lots of places. We were the muggins, you know, we were the fools who fell for it at the same time as gay marriage and a bunch of other things. So there's a sort of an international relay race, and this really isn't just about trans issues. This is a kind of policy-making thing. Like, globally, there are lots and lots of people between academics and charities and think tanks and NGOs who, on any given issue, are trying to maneuver to see how best they can get what they want. And, you know, that's kind of fine. Like, they're very right to do it that way. But it tends to be that you create international bodies that put forward best practice, or you tell one government that somebody else has done something and that worked very well and that's best practice and they should copy it. And, you know, that's the way you play it. And this has very much happened with gender self-ID. So the sort of spine of all of this is these two strange documents that are named for this Indonesian city that I've learned how to pronounce properly. It looks like Yogyakarta, but it's actually said Yogyakarta. So the Yogyakarta is a tourist city in Indonesia. And in late 2006, a bunch of people met mostly to discuss gay rights, because they can't do much on gay rights at an international level because all the international forums have countries that are just not going to do anything on it. So the idea of this one was to create sort of strategies and model documents that could be used individually in national campaigns. But there was a bit of stuff there about this new thing, gender identity. And they created this new acronym, SOGI, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And the document that was published in 2007 yokes the two of them together. And all the way through says, these two things need to be legislated. And they used the most extreme law of the time, namely the Britain's Gender Recognition Act of 2004, as their model for everyone. That was the only law at the time that didn't mandate surgery before changing legal sex. Fast forward 10 years, and idiots here have gone for gender self-ID all in one big step because of offers of best practice, and they did it in Argentina and so on. And we and the other two have got used as the examples that everyone else is meant to copy now. Mm-hmm. So, they use the baseline as the norm in these sort of lobbying efforts. So why did we fall for it? We had a lot else going on. I think we would have fallen for it in the UK too, but a bunch of things kind of intervened, namely Brexit. Like, we were all set to just put it into law. There was a government proposal to do it. It had been passed through the relevant committee. It was women who were putting it forward. It was the Women in Equality Select Committee. And then Brexit kind of slowed everything down and gave time for the organisers to come in. So you're having to fight an action to overturn something, whereas they were lucky. They were given a 4 years delay and they were able to organise and just by the skin of their teeth stop the law from changing.
Now, in Ireland, we face exactly the same law as Biden has just brought in with his executive order, which is an amendment to equality legislation to amend it to include gender identity as a grounds. We view this very much as the meta template trans law, as in it will very likely, in all likelihood, obliterate single-sex provision for girls in this country without the need of a gender recognition certificate. Can you tell us a bit about your research into the Equality Act in the UK? Now, there is a slight difference because in Ireland, we are even more on the back foot because we don't have sex as a grounds, we have gender. So we're already weakened. But can you tell us, with that caveat, can you tell us a bit about your research specifically about gender legislation in the UK?
So there are two laws with the same name. One is the UK's Equality Act, which passed in 2010, and then there's this proposed legislation in the US, which has the same name but is very different. So the UK's Equality Act in 2010, it has its flaws, but in concept, it's quite a model. It brings together about 100 different sorts of laws and court rulings and so on into a single overarching framework for equality and discrimination law. And it lists 9 protected characteristics. 2 of which everybody can't have. One of them is pregnancy and maternity, and the other one is disability, but the others are all in principle things that all of us have. Like, everybody has a sex, everybody has beliefs, because it includes lack of belief. Everybody has a race. It doesn't say, that you can't discriminate against women. It says you can't discriminate on the grounds of sex. You can't discriminate on the basis of belief. And then it sets these out, and it also sets out exceptions and ways that you can resolve conflicts. So the classic conflict until the latest issues came along with gender identity would have been between people who were of conservative religions and gay people in the workplace. So that would have been the meat and drink of the sorts of Equality Act things that arrived in employment tribunals. And it has been already established that both of those people have rights. You can't tell a conservative Muslim or a conservative Christian that they must go, rah, rah, I love gay marriage. They don't have to. They can be conscientious objectors to that. What they can't do is infringe on the rights of a gay colleague or harass them, and rightly so. The gay colleague can't insist that everybody signs up to thinking that gay marriage is right either. So that's the sort of overarching idea. Everybody has rights, everybody has characteristics. Sometimes these butt up against each other. None of them wins out over any other. Everything has overarching aims. Employers can't be expected to accommodate absolutely everything. They can't, have to spend absolutely loads to accommodate a particular disabled person, but they should make reasonable accommodations. And one of those characteristics is not gender identity. This is really important. It's gender reassignment. Now, it's very vaguely defined, but it's still meant to be something objective. It's not a statement you make about yourself. It's a process you're going through. And so if somebody comes in and says, I want to present myself as a woman from now on, that you can't be sacked on the basis of that, and rightly so. The question is, how does the employer accommodate it? What's reasonable? How might that infringe upon other protected characteristics, such as sex, which is a protected characteristic? Now, all of this has been thrown out the window a bit because of the lobby groups like Stonewall, which tell flat out lies to employers when they give them advice. I mean, they tell them, for example, that gender reassignment changes your sex for the purpose of what facilities you're allowed to use. It absolutely does not. Someone who has the characteristic of gender reassignment has to be accommodated, and that's right. It doesn't change their sex. They don't have to be treated as a member of the opposite sex because in law they're not. In law, the only people who are members of the opposite sex are those who change their sex with their legal sex with the Gender Recognition Act, and that's only about 5,000 people. And even then there are exceptions. So the law says you don't have to admit women who are legally women because they have changed their sex into certain sensitive spaces or into women's sports or that sort of thing. So as a law and as a way to frame it all, it's quite a model. Really, people have many characteristics, and these require accommodation in services and in employment. And you have to think about everybody and think about trade-offs and conflicts.
It's really, really interesting. Yeah, it's always important to remember how in Ireland we have the law that was brought in by stealth, but then we are seeing the beginning of public capture, policy capture. Whereas in the UK, you stop short of that law because you had those years to organise. But
Exactly.
you have de facto self-ID because of a misinterpretation of that law.
Yes, but these legal cases, and we've got a lot of them this year, and you're going to be hearing from Maya. She's got one of the very important cases because Maya is hoping to, she'll tell you more about it, but anyway, she's hoping to get it recognised that her beliefs, her feminist beliefs in the immutability and consequentiality of sex are a protected characteristic. And in that case, she's been illegally discriminated against. So that's one of the cases. Kira Bell, her judicial review of the Tavistock. There's a bunch of other important cases. There's one about female prisoners with a male prisoner who assaulted one of them, moved in with them. It's 5 or 6 cases, and all of them can make it be that we have to return to the law as opposed to this overreach. One of the most important ones is Alison Bailey against Stonewall, whom she alleges that Stonewall essentially colluded with her employer to get her fired, and fired for reasons that are to do with her being a lesbian and with being a woman. Namely that she was one of the people who founded the LGBT Alliance, which hopes to replace Stonewall as a proper representative of gay people in the UK. So even if she loses, as Alison may, because it's a complex case, she's alleging indirect discrimination. She's getting the most explosive material out into the open domain. Just a couple of days ago, this letter that Stonewall wrote to her employers, in effect saying, nice legal chambers you have there, will be a shame if anything happened to them. About Alison, that's now in the public domain, so people see what's going on.
I mean, I think the more court cases that can happen, the better, because this is then said in court, and it's everyone can see it. Likewise with the Kira Bell judgment, which was just a beautiful piece of jurisprudence.
Absolutely, absolutely. First time.
I was really struck by what you said about that what we do here on the ground in Ireland is like what Stonewall first did, and I always think about the fact that the Irish government didn't cave to demands of trans people, trans-identified people, because they were marching on the streets protesting. This is very much, this gender ideology is a top-down ideology, which has just seeped into the mainstream culture. But yes, it's before we finish up, is there anything you would like to, what message you would like to give to activists on the ground in Ireland as kind of one of the thought leaders of the movement in the UK? And you're at a different stage of the timeline, and obviously there are some differences, but what can we learn, what can we apply to what's happening here?
I suppose it's going to have to be person at a time now that the law is there, isn't it? I mean, things generally should be. I'm actually a big believer in things having to bring everybody along with them. I remember people saying things like, it's not right that other people should have the right to vote on whether I have the right to marry. But look at what happened. We got such an amazing result. It brought the country together. And now there's nobody who can deny that Irish people want gay people to be able to marry. So I think, in a way, it's daunting to say we have to bring everyone along with us, or a lot of people along with us. But you know what? That's how everything durable happens. And it's also upsetting to think just how shallow women's rights really were. But, we can't look back. We can only look forward, and we can only look to our sisters and get strength from each other. And every person who, people only move in one direction. And so I'm seeing a couple of the questions pop up, and one of them is my book title. So it's
I was going to ask you that. Are you allowed to tell us the name?
Yeah, Trans from Ideology to Reality, or When Ideology Meets Reality, I beg your pardon. So that's the face-off, isn't it? There's people who say how the world should be, and there's people who go, well, look, we're mammals. There's mammalian but biology, and then there's these weird queer theory ideas about what makes you a man or a woman. And that's, I suppose, the final part of what I'd say to comfort people. When you have reality, as in bedrock physical reality on your side, you do have something very strong behind you. You know, female people won't be wished out of existence by us pretending that you can call males females. We still exist. And so people only move one way.
Yeah. And I think as well, we have to remember that women are 50%, females are 50% of every population.
More, we're 52%.
52%. And we all live in democracies. So it's about making our presence felt, making our voice heard. You know, we will be heard.
Yes.
And also, I totally agree with you. You know, it's my opinion that 9 out of 10 people agree with our stance. Our stance is not fringe or radical.
Oh, not at all. That's why they silence us. They silence us because as soon as we say it, I had a lunch, a private lunch that I wasn't allowed to report on, and with somebody who was very senior in a university gender studies department. She said so many turfy things without realizing it. You know, it turned out she didn't know that men were being locked up in women's prisons. And when I told her, she went, "Oh, well, you can't really be doing that. And, you know, well, you should keep the rapists out anyway." And you're like, you're a turf. You just don't know it. Exactly. So yeah, really nearly all of us are. So once you get through people's belief that we are bigots, and they realize that, you know, the other side really genuinely mean males should be allowed into women's sports, males should be allowed into women's prisons, and so on, everybody agrees with us. You really have to have gone down the rabbit hole not to.
Yeah. Thank you. That's just so clear as ever. I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy that this is happening in Ireland, because I've been looking across the water and thinking, when are you going to get going?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Some just brilliant insights as usual. And please stick around. Come back at 4:30 for the Q&A.
And thank you to everyone who said, buying the book, buying the book. That's what I want you all to do, to buy the book.
We all will.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, Helen. So next up, it's my great pleasure to introduce FIONA McANENA from Fair Play for Women. FIONA is a Derry native who studied natural sciences in Cambridge, won a rowing blue, and she's worked for many, many different global multinationals, but has dedicated the last 3 years of her life to advising Fair Play for Women. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the conference, FIONA.
Thank you, Lisa.
The first conference of its kind in Ireland, and we're very proud to be hosting it, the first ever gender critical conference. FIONA, how did you first get drawn into gender critical activism and get involved with Fair Play for Women?
Well, for me personally, it started in the summer of 2018. And I think there were two things that really caught my attention. So one of them was a character called Pips Bunce, who's known as Philip Bunce 2 or 3 days a week, and Pips Bunce is the other days and works for Credit Suisse in London. And Pips featured on an FT sponsored list of women in finance as some sort of role model. And I thought, well, that's fine. You know, be brave, dress how you like, change your name, cool. But what you're not is a role model for women. And Pip's profile on Twitter said Pips was a proud father and husband. And, you know, there was no pretense that this was a man. It was someone who cross-dressed and went to work. And that was fine. But when I tweeted back to Pips and Credit Suisse that Pips should be proud of, you know, expressing how Pips wanted to be at work, but that's not a role model for women. They both blocked me. I thought, well, I've been blocked by Credit Suisse. I mean, I'm not some sort of activist. It seemed completely bonkers. And then immediately, as you know, once you start looking, you start to see all this stuff that's going on. And at the same time, there was a consultation, public consultation, being run by the City of London, the sort of municipal body that administers the City of London public properties, about adopting gender neutral facilities. And this meant that all the toilets, all that would be gender neutral, and that the Hampstead ponds would be gender neutral. So where there was a women's pond, but bathing pond, swimming pool, outdoor swimming pool, a men's one and a mixed one, that they would all have to be open to all. I thought, this is daft. So I filled in the consultation, and at the beginning of this consultation, you had to basically declare that you believed that gender identity was a real thing, and that it was, you know, it trumped, I can't remember, you had to say that what your philosophical belief was. I thought, this doesn't make sense. Why is that relevant in any way to whether I believe there should still be single-sex swimming pools and toilets? And then what happened was that the people running that consultation basically set aside all the responses where women like me or people like me hadn't said the right thing ideologically right at the beginning. So they eventually published their results, in which something like 40,000 were just discounted for not having the right opinion. And then of the remaining 50,000 or something, they were able to say they had a majority in favor. And the whole thing, it went very fast for me. I think that happens to a lot of people. Now, at the same time, Fair Play for Women already existed, and there were already women campaigning led by Dr. Nicola Williams in response to the government consultation about the Gender Recognition Act. So the proposal to change it to self-ID, which people will know about. And they were out there on the streets, they were campaigning, they were wearing red t-shirts saying, hands off my rights. You can see pictures of them on our website. And most of those women are still part of our group behind the scenes. And I sort of got involved at the tail end of that. And then probably the very beginning of 2019, I started to work with the group much more, and then just got more and more involved. I mean, it's fair to say that Nicola Williams is really the one who's dedicated, you know, years of her life, most of it so far unpaid, thankfully, no, not now, but she's really put her heart and soul into this, and she's inspired a lot of people, and she certainly inspired me. And that's why I'm working with the group. One thing to say about the consultation is that the website was organized, our website was organized so that you could do an instant response to the consultation that would appear to the government and show that where it had come from. So your response was automated, made easy for you, and it was obvious to the government it had been facilitated through the Fair Play for Women website. And when the government finally announced the results of the consultation, they commented that the single biggest source of response had been marshaled by Stonewall, and that was about 38%. And the next biggest source of response was Fair Play for Women, and that was about 18%. So that probably was quite significant in making sure that it was understood that, you know, there was a force representing women, and no one could say you're just a, you know, grassroots movement, you don't count, you have to. So even though we have no funding, well, we'll talk about funding in a minute, actually, because it turns out people feel pretty strongly about some of these issues, and they do put their hands in their pockets. But at that time, you know, Fair Play for Women, and still now, has no state funding or grant funding or public funding, and we're up against these groups like Stonewall and Gendered Intelligence and all of those who get hundreds of thousands in public funding. So it's not a very equal fight at all. That's how I got started.
So in Ireland, our sort of timeline was, we really did drag our feet actually with regard to self-ID compared to Britain, but then we had a test case and around the same time, and then we had Goodwin, and obviously that's instructive to us as we're members of the European Union, and so our test case was reinstated back to the High Court, and it was from that moment onwards in Ireland really that the train was put in motion. So from 2007 onwards we had an advisory board, but what many people don't realise was that advisory board actually recommended the medical model, and that was switched at the very last minute with less than 4 weeks to go to full self-ID, and only 4 public representatives, 4 deputies on a select subcommittee made that switch. So that tells you all you need to know about how democratic this whole process was. But in England, obviously, it was done very much in the open. Do you think that's what enabled and empowered women to organise so well as they did, particularly Fair Play for Women, that they had that very visible timeline?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly. I mean, there have been people talking about this and working on this for years. You know, Julie Bindel wrote about it in 2004. Germaine Greer wrote about it. Stephanie Davis-Arai started Transgender Trend in 2015 to start to push back against the ideology that was being pushed into schools and to try and assert the law. You know, Helen's talked about the fact that the law, the Equality Act, is perfectly clear, but people are being told something completely different, and they're believing it. And that's partly because of the guidance, actually, that comes from the statutory bodies that interpret. It's not just Stonewall. There are other problems too. So although the basic law is sound, you know, we have a lot of things to push back on because we have a sort of de facto self-ID. But you're quite right that although those early groups and individuals saw what was going on and mobilized against it, a lot of people really had no idea. We were all of the be kind, accommodate them school, turn a blind eye to that person. And it was when GRA consultation was being talked about as being not just someone can become legally female, but actually anyone can become legally female, that people thought, hold on a minute, this is going to give us a big problem. So yes, that mobilization did two things. It absolutely, put the agenda, put the topic out there, and it made a lot of people realize the threat of self-ID. But the other thing it did, Leisha, for me and for many people, was helped us understand that we already had, as I say, a kind of de facto self-ID. We already had all the sports bodies, from the IOC all the way down to all the national governing bodies of practically every sport here, and I'm sure Ireland is the same, where it's not about whether you've legally changed your gender. It's not about having a gender recognition certificate. It's about a philosophy that says, well, if that's what you say you are, then you are. And the girls just have to budge up. And so we have still a huge amount of work to do. And so even though we can say that we've won for now on the Gender Recognition Act being changed to full self-ID, we have so much work to do to undo all the policies, all the ideological capture, all the presumptions, some in good faith, that the law does mean that anyone who says their woman's a woman and you can't do anything about that, and that you're a bigot if you object.
Yeah, and
that in prison, and we had the case in the prison's judicial review last week.
With regards just to policy capture, I totally agree with you. I feel like it's like you unearth these tentacles almost by chance. You only realize it's there kind of often by accident. So like in Ireland, we have GPs being told to tell patients that puberty blockers are reversible because those guides were written by the biggest trans lobby group here. It's very insidious. We have, like every other country, we have anti-bullying resources being used as a Trojan horse in schools, and then children are being indoctrinated into gender ideology via anti-bullying resources.
Yeah.
So you come across this across the public sector, but you as a group have really focused in on a few areas. Can you tell me about your particular areas of expertise? Sports. Yeah. You were involved at the World Rugby Roundtable. Can you just talk us about your specific areas?
Yes, I mean, the first area of focus was prisons, and the reason for that was that back in 2017, when Nicola Williams saw what was going on in prisons and began to understand that there were, as Helen has already said, there were violent men in prison with women, and they were assaulting them. And even if you weren't being assaulted, you're being terrified, and intimidated. And so she thought someone has to do something, because women in prison have so little, and they have almost no one to advocate for them. There are one or two groups who speak for them, but for whatever reason, this had all just been pushed through to accommodate the expectations of certain males. And that was the beginning, really, of that focus, which, as you know, culminated in the judicial review in the High Court last week against the policy, where we were a witness in that. It was brought by an individual prisoner, but we were a witness. And then the other big area that we've focused on is sport. And I suppose that's because it's so bloody obvious, isn't it? Sport affects so many people. It's not just about elite sport. It's not just about money. It's about children in school and women feeling confident. And, women and girls have had to fight so hard to get proper sport. And even now, most countries will have targets about trying to increase female participation in sport, because girls are known to drop out through adolescence in a way that boys don't. And so women's sport is finally getting going, and now it's under threat, and it's just been so casually given away. It's quite extraordinary. And the thing about sport as a focus for this is that it's obvious, it's common sense, everyone can see it. It's nothing to do with anyone's motivation. It's not accusing anyone of anything. You can be really positive about the right of everyone, including trans people, to live their best life and still believe in sex segregation in sport. And as Helen said, it's in the law. It's one of the specifically named areas of exception in the law where you can discriminate on the grounds of sex, as in you can segregate. So those were the two big areas. And then we started to see that we had to defend the language as well, because if you don't protect the language, then all the information gets distorted. So you know, we started to see that, for example, crime records were being distorted because the police were starting to capture people's gender identity instead of their sex. Through a freedom of information, a whole series of freedom of information requests to all the separate police forces in the UK, we discovered that the police were now recording at a perpetrator's request their gender identity rather than their sex. And then that was being picked up by the Crown Prosecution Service. It was adopted by the courts in the Equal Treatment Bench Book. Then the media were doing it too, partly justified by the fact that that's what they were hearing in court. And so you got all this stuff where you had, you know, a woman rapist, women suddenly seemingly an explosion of child sexual abuse or use of pornography by women, all kinds of stuff. And of course, every time you see that story, you think, hang on a minute. But usually the defense would be, well, that's what they said in court, or this person identifies as a woman. And so we realized that in order to be able to have honest conversations about what was really going on, why the crime data mattered, why sex segregation exists in the first place, we needed to protect the language. We needed to fight back against people being allowed to simply assert that they were female. So that's another area that we've been working on. And
now,
language and data go together. Just one thing, language and data go together. That's the thing. And without data, you can't fight this. So you have to protect the language in order to protect the data.
Some people say that, you know, the push for self-ID happened first in prisons because those women are the ones who don't have as much agency and don't have people advocating for them and are the least likely to complain. And we feel very strongly as a group that if no one else will speak up for those women in Ireland, you know, we will. The statistics are the same all over the world. In Ireland, there's only, on any given day, 3% of the overall population of prisoners in Ireland is female. So even a tiny number of men who identify as women really actually skews that and can really have a massive impact on a tiny population. You know, in Limerick, we're talking about 29, 30 women on a wing. And this is so timely, this conversation, because only this week, a third violent male has been sent to the female estate in Ireland. This is a man who fractured another man, a man who identifies as a woman who fractured another man's skull, and that man later died. So yeah, we feel very strongly that this might be a trickle at the moment, but it will turn into larger numbers. In terms of your campaigning around this issue, did you find it difficult to bring it to raise consciousness and awareness around this? Because obviously in the culture, prisoners, even female prisoners, are dehumanized, and people think they're just out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, and people have no idea really how different the profiles of prisoners are. You know, we've got less than 4,000 women in prison, almost none of them for anything violent, and therefore the women's estate tends to be fairly open, low security. We've got nearly 80,000 men in prison. It topped at 90,000. It's in the 80s now, and you know, many of them are violent or have committed sexual offences. So people don't understand that women in prison by and large are there for different reasons. And as you say, there's no one to advocate for them. Just coming back to what you said before, people might be interested to know this. I think you are right that there was a big push to start in prisons, and there's some anecdotal evidence about, in Scotland particularly, that a campaign group said, well, we'll do this in Scottish prisons first, and then we'll be able to spread it out. One of the other things that happened in Scottish prisons was lots of people used to say they were Jewish, and the reason they did was the kosher food had to be prepared separately, and it was better. It was on a higher per capita budget, and it was better food. And because that was costing the prison service money, they then required people to prove that they were Jewish. And guess what? The numbers fell by 3/4. But guess what grew at the same time? Gender identification. And some of the people in Scottish prisons now, some of the one or two of the more better known trans-identifying males in Scottish prisons were previously identifying as Jewish, and now they're identifying as women. Who knows what's in their heads? It's not for me to say, but you know, there is when the prisons policy was being made for England and Wales, prison psychologists said people will take advantage of this. People will identify, men will identify as women because they know that the women's estate is a softer option. Never mind whether they have any other motivation. Yeah. It's just going to be obvious. And then as you've sort of suggested, women in prison are disproportionately likely to have been victims of male violence before they get to prison. Somewhere between a half and 2/3 will have been victims. So if you're a terrified woman, it's in prison, which should be bad enough, really, especially if all you've done is fail to pay your fines, which is often the case, and then you find yourself in prison with a violent male. That is terrifying. That's way beyond what any woman should have to, or any person should have to endure.
And I think as well, we all agree that this is the most vulnerable cohort in all of society, in or out of prison, because they tend to be in and out, serving very short sentences, as you say, for largely addiction and poverty linked crimes. In Ireland, according to a 2006 study, women in prison in Ireland are 7 times more likely to self-harm than men in prison. So that just tells you all you need to know about the extreme psychological distress and vulnerability that they already have as a population, without putting rapists, sex offenders, and in with them. So fair play for women are really seen as trustworthy. You've positioned yourself in that way in the field by being very measured and by your particular focus. How do you think you've done that, and what lessons can we learn in Ireland in regard to that, particularly because, as I keep saying, the theme of the conference is resisting captivity. We don't have a sympathetic ear, left or right, opposition, coalition, government, so we need to be strategic, really, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that it probably comes back to the fact that that Dr. Nicola Williams is a research scientist by training. We're very data driven. We would rarely, I might actually, but she would never assert anything without a good evidence base. And one of the things that really, it's helped in people knowing that they can trust us, that we don't assert, we're evidence based, we stick to the law, we know our facts, we reference every claim we make on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have dug into the data and revealed things that other people didn't realize. And that has probably been the most powerful tool in starting to mobilize resistance and starting to get policy discussions happening where previously it was all a done deal. So I mentioned the freedom of information request to the police. It started to reveal what they were doing. Nick's work is also part of what revealed what was going on in prisons. And how people are so concerned for trans women in prison and say that they're vulnerable. Well, it was our work that revealed that the criminality pattern of trans women in prison is like that of men and not like that of women. And that's very important, because no one would suggest, even though most men are law-abiding, no one would suggest that men should be in women's prisons. We still have sex segregation. Yeah. And the same is true. If the pattern of criminality is a male one, then that's where, they don't belong with women. That is simply not a reasonable thing to do. So I think that the data, the rigor, the analysis, and almost, not assuming that because something seems obvious to you, people know it. It's kind of, as Helen talked about that interview she had, it's shocking how people are making assumptions. They mostly make the assumption that people who have not had surgery could not access women's spaces and women's prisons and women's refuges, and we know that's not true. They somehow seem to think that because the sports bodies have all said, well, it's fine, and maybe you suppress your testosterone and then it's fine, that somehow that creates a level playing field. But your own common sense tells you that's not true. But still, we have to.
The power of male puberty cannot be overcome by tweaks in hormones.
Yeah, but sure, evidencing that is also important. So being really, and I guess that the other thing is that we're really focused on women and girls. Other people will speak for other groups, but this is who we represent. And our primary concern is about protecting the rights that we have in law. So we've no beef with any other group. We've no beef with men. We've no beef with trans people. We just need certain things for women and girls that the law says that we're entitled to.
And can you tell us about your recent judicial case review challenging the ONS and its of the census?
It's tomorrow morning. Yeah, we just filed our second bundle at 10 o'clock this morning, which is why I'm now able to talk to you. So, you know, so that was something that's been going on for a long time. Data users back in late 2019, 80 different academics in the UK wrote to the Office for National Statistics and said, you know, you need to keep collecting a decent question. You need a clear question on sex. Sex is binary, as we have already heard, and none of us is surprised. And the sex question in the census says, which are you, male or female? The problem is that the ONS had decided, clearly you can tell this from the trail, that they really wanted to let trans people answer according to how they felt and not what they were. And so that program of kind of consultation has been back and forth, bouncing around, data users trying to make sure that good data was still available. And they settled on what seemed like a really sensible thing, which was, yes, of course you have the sex question. And you also have two other voluntary questions. One is sexual orientation and one is gender identity. And that's up to you. If you want to say something about that, you do that. And then we would start to know the true profiles of those populations, which we've never known before. And at the very last minute, the 12th of February, for the census, has started and is census day is the 21st of March, at the very last minute, having said that they would go with legal sex, what ONS published was basically, unless you've changed your passport, then you can put that. So they published guidance that most of us, we never need to look at because we know what sex we are, but anyone who's considering how to answer will look at guidance that may tell them that they can be either male or female.
I felt that open letter was very arresting by various mathematicians and statisticians saying, you know, once this data is lost, the metadata, it's lost forever. You know, I think
other people will follow that lead. Other people follow, because if it's somehow not okay to ask people what sex they are, if even the census doesn't do it, then other people won't do it either. And we've seen that. We've seen in healthcare studies, for example, where people are starting to say, what's your gender, male, female, other?
Yeah.
I mean, arguably with gender, there could be another, but of course they're using that as a synonym for sex. And what other could there be? But if we lose the sex data, and the way that the ONS has designed this guidance, we won't know whether people are self-identifying according to a trans identity or actually giving us their birth sex and then going on to say later they're trans. So we won't even be able to follow the trans population. Their information will also be you know, somewhat sullied by the fact that you can only tell whether that you can only sort out trans males and trans females if you know what they are to start with. So it's a mess. It's no good for anyone. The same with the sexual orientation data. We won't be able to.
It's almost a fight for empiricism and objective, observable material reality, isn't it?
And it matters because it matters to everybody. And if what you want is more trans healthcare, you should want to be able to say how many trans people of each sex requiring different treatments there are, and across what age groups and where in the country. But if some of those people have declared their sex as their gender identity or vice versa, you won't be able to measure that. So this doesn't even serve the trans population well. But as I say, that's not our primary concern. Our concern is what you've just said, Leisha, which is if we drift away from recording sex segregated data in the census, that will happen right across our society, and all kinds of things will be lost and will be extremely hard to recover.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, in no other area would the norms of, say, medical practice be thrown out the window, with the norms of data gathering, you know, and we do this at our peril for all of society, including trans-identified people. I couldn't agree more. You mentioned there in terms of, you know, how if we record men who identify as women, sex offenders as female, then that clearly skews the data in a huge way. I mean, in Ireland, our recent figures from 2018, the number of female sex offenders, according to the official record has doubled, and it's doubled because there are two, but one of them is a physical male who identifies as a female. And recently, you know, the problem with this is captured institutions like the BBC will then report that there's been an 84% increase in female sex offenders. And then do you feel in some ways it's all a bit linked? And what I mean by that is maybe not consciously, but if people see that in the news and they trust that story and they don't dig behind it and see, oh, well, it was because a number of males who identified as female. But then it does it create a hardening of attitudes to women? Does it disappear male pattern violence? Does it mean then we can't argue for single sex provision, which after all is predicated on the fact that we don't know which men are the decent men and which are the predators? Do you think it feeds into each other?
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's partly why those in favor of promoting this ideology are very comfortable with that kind of blurring, you know, of the language and the data. I mean, like I say, they should care about the census data being accurate for their own benefit, but they don't, because it's all being eroded. Another thing I would say for people pushing against this is that's why you have to keep coming back to the facts, and you may have to be the people who disclose the facts, you know. So one of the things that was quite revealing in the court hearing last week on the prisons policy, the transgender prisoners policy judicial review, was the judge expressed surprise that the prison service didn't know how many trans prisoners they had. They did not know. Mm-hmm. I mean, what a mess. So
it reminds me of the Kira Bell judgment, where you know, that beautiful piece of jurisprudence, the three judges keep saying we're surprised by the lack of data, by the lack of curiosity in terms of, you know, 75% female population of girls.
Well, one of the things the judge said last week in the prisons case was when the defense barrister was saying, well, anecdotally, I think we have blah, blah, blah. And he said, anecdotally is not good. And he said, you can't make policy on anecdote.
No,
in a way, that's what's happened, because when you think about it, a lot of the time, the reason why we all get maneuvered into accommodating whoever we're supposed to accommodate is because of the emotional card that is played about the poor trans person, and, you know, the person needs sport, or they need to be accommodated, or they're at risk if they're in a prison, or they may be assaulted or abused if they're in a male toilet or whatever. And on the one hand, I've talked about using the facts and using information and digging. On the other hand, we also need to play the emotional card, use emotion too, because for every male who gets into women's sport, there's a female who's lost her place.
Yes.
And if you're worried about the male who, you know, needs the fulfillment of sport, or whose mental health is benefited by all of that, all of which I sympathize with and agree with, if you're worried about that person, you equally should be thinking about the person, the woman who loses that opportunity. Doesn't she count just as much? And so I think, you know, we at Fair Pay for Women have built a reputation out of being very fact-based, data-driven, revealing things, a picture that people didn't see. I think it's important also to bring up the individual stories and engage people's emotions. And if you're going to be kind to one group of citizens, you know, or one individual, have the same empathy and the same kindness for the female on the other side of it.
Yeah, I think that's so true. You know, in Ireland thus far, this is, as I said, it's been told from the point of view of the trans-identified person, and obviously we all have sympathy for anyone who's struggling, but it's about widening the lens to include, you know, the children, a child in school who may not be comfortable sharing their changing room. Like, it just reminds me, I was talking to this woman, an Irish woman based in Vancouver, actually. And, you know, Canada is very instructive for us. It's a much bigger country, and it's kind of further along the timeline, but it's also a self-ID country like we are. And, you know, we need to really pay close attention to those countries, in my view. But she told me that she used to swim laps in a local swimming pool every day before work. And she did that. That was just a kind of her routine. And then one day she went in and she closed the door behind her, and there was no one else in the changing room except a fully intact male who was fully naked, and he just smiled at her. And she said her whole body just froze. You know, and she doesn't do that. She doesn't go swimming anymore because males like him are allowed into the female changing room.
Yeah.
So exactly what you said, it's about reminding ourselves and trying to get that message out. This is not an abstract notion. It's not abstract. It will impact, and it does impact women and girls.
Yeah.
And we all need to care.
Yeah. I mean, you know, one thing to add to that I think that example illustrates, and this is something that Maya has always articulated really well, is the principle of consent.
Yes.
We shouldn't have to justify our expectation of single-sex spaces. If a sign has got the little woman graphic over it, then you go in there fully trusting and expecting that only female people will be in there. And you're not accusing that person of anything other than being in the space where you didn't expect to find them. And it is universally acknowledged. It's promoted by the World Health Organization and the United Nations and everybody that single-sex facilities are a good thing. Yes. And so we don't have to accuse anyone of anything to be able to say, we didn't decide that we didn't want these anymore. And actually we do still want them. And do you know what? Even if some women don't want them, enough of us do. So
and nor do we have to discuss any particular traumas or experiences that we've had. I don't think that should be the bar, actually. I think it should just be that these are our protections in order to participate in society, full stop.
Yeah.
Fiona, that was a wonderful chat, as always. Thank you so much for taking part. I think we have a lot to learn ourselves in the Countess with regard to positioning and tone and just overall how you have been able to just get the ear of journalists and politicians in the UK. It's really inspiring for us.
Thank you. We have a long way to go, but hopefully, we'll help each other.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Before I introduce our next panelist, I'm just making sure everyone can see me. Before I introduce our next panelist, I just want to make sure everyone is fully across all of our platforms. So we're on Instagram. We have a new handle on Instagram. It's thecountess.ie. We are on Facebook. We're streaming live on Facebook at the moment on our Facebook page. We're also on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is our acronym. And we have a new website which is being developed. Now, I know a lot of you have been contacting us and joining our mailing list, and there were problems with that, but they have now been resolved. So please, everyone, take a moment today or now, if possible, to sign up to our mailing list, because our call to action today is that, this is something that has happened in Ireland without our consent. We weren't consulted, but we will be heard. So without further ado, it's my great honor to welcome our next panelist. He is a human rights and prisons expert. He's based in Colombia, and he's a former board member of the Irish Penal Reform Trust. He's been openly critical of the Irish policy of housing males who identify as female in with women in the women's estate. It's my great honor to introduce Garoj Olansig. Dear great Garoj, how are you?
Okay.
Great to have you here with us today, all the way from Bogota. Have I said that correctly? How did you say it to me earlier? Bogota, was it?
Bogota. It's the accent.
Yeah. I think that's beyond me. Garoj, it's great to have you here. We're always so interested to hear your perspective as someone who kind of views this through the lens of prison reform, the historical context of prison reform, and also the geographical context of prisons, all around the world and in the global, including the global South. So I'll start off by asking you, up until recently, it was just a given that if a man was a convicted rapist, or if he was charged with rape but on remand, or if he had a stated intention to murder and rape women, all of those men would have been housed in prison to keep women safe. They would have been separated from women and from society in order to keep women safe. But as we go out here live today, those three cases are currently being housed in the female estate locked in with women in Ireland, in the upside down, as I call it. How did you first become aware of this policy?
Well, I was a bit taken back by surprise. I mean, when the whole trans issue first cropped up, well, on my radar, was when Germaine Greer was no platformed. And it just seemed like something that was, far away, academic, in a university, an extension of that intolerant wave sweeping across US campuses, where debates are reduced to who is the most offended person in the audience. And it didn't seem like something that was real, that would have an impact on social policy. And then is jailed and put into the women's prison. And I sort of thought at the time, well, surely the Penal Reform Trust would have something to say about this, because I'd been on its board, back 2004 to 2005, just before I moved back out to Colombia. And they did actually have something to say about it. It was just not what I was expecting them to say, because it went against everything that they'd been saying for years, not just them, penal reform organizations right around the world. The whole idea, the demands of penal reform organizations center around making prisons, for example, safer for all inmates. And all inmates includes women. In fact, one of the great advances in prison reform was the idea that you would separate prisoners by sex, between men and women, and from children. And this is not a new idea. This goes right back to the late 1700s. That's how far back we're slipping on the issue, that you would separate people according to certain categories. And this was done out of a concern for protection, men in relation to women and adults in relation to children. And even nowadays, there are jurisdictions where even amongst the adult population, they distinguish between young adults, 18 to 21-year-olds, for example, and older adults, again, with this whole concern around protecting people who are in custody. There are people who are in a vulnerable situation. So I sort of thought, well, the logical thing would be that the Penal Reform Trust would say, hey, hold on a minute, we can't do this, right? And what I found was, not only did they agree with going to Limerick prison, in 2016, they came up with a report that basically advocated that. And it was quite surprising, and the report itself is it's called Out on the Inside. It's really, really disappointing. And it does something which sort of like seems to be standard now in all discussions around trans issues, is you mix the issue of transgenders with lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. So when you read the Penal Reform Trust's report, lesbian, gays, and bisexuals are in there, they're all over the place. And then suddenly, on the tail end, the trans prisoner is brought in, and everything you've said prior to that is used as a justification in relation to some particular policy on trans issues. Now, lesbian, gay, and bisexuals in prison has always been, or has long been, an issue of concern for people interested in penal reform. Either because in some countries, being gay in and of itself is a criminal offence, or having a gay relationship, same-sex relationship, is a criminal offence. And they would have, prison organisations would have argued, obviously, for the decriminalisation, the legalisation of gay relationships, etc. And then there were problems for gay prisoners within the prison, either due to victimisation from prison staff or victimisation from other prisoners. So this has always been an issue of concern. What was new about the Penal Reform Trust was how they latched on the issue of transgender prisoners onto that. And they were actually very, very dishonest in the way they did it and what they had to say about them.
I actually read that report, and I remember feeling sick to my stomach actually, because I remember, I'll never forget it. They put, in terms of, they were kind of ranking prisoners in terms of vulnerability, who was the most vulnerable. And they had trans-identified males as more vulnerable than mothers and even pregnant women. I think that says all you need to know about the capture of that institution.
Well, you see, one of the things about when you look at the debates around prison issues and trans prisoners, some of these organizations, not all prison reform organizations have swallowed the Kool-Aid. You have to be clear about that, right? The Penal Reform Trust has. But you get an idea from prisons that prisons are dangerous places for transgender prisoners, and are sort of okay for everybody else.
Yeah.
Prisons are actually terrible places to be in, right? Prisons are not nice places. They're not good for your physical health, your mental health. And most of them are actually pretty horrible physically. I mean, as part of my work here in Colombia, until the pandemic kicked in, I was going in and out of the major prison here, one of the two major prisons here in Bogota. I was going in and out of every 3 weeks. We're doing workshops, and I've been to other prisons. And no prison is really, the nicest prison I've ever been inside of is the Docas unit in Ireland. Yeah? Every other prison, they're horrible places. They're not nice, and they're dangerous. But they're dangerous for every prisoner. And what the Penal Reform Trust did in the report is ignored that and talked about prisons in terms of how vulnerable trans prisoners were. And they used, some of the things they say about prisons in the report are actually true. But they're true for all prisoners. One of the things that, one of the reasons that they give for housing Barbie Kardashian and people like him in a women's prison is the danger of sexual violence, right, in prisons. So, and people who don't work on prison issues could be forgiven for making a whole load of assumptions and mistakes in relation to sexual violence in prisons, partly due to Hollywood films and stuff like that, and popular myths. But actually, most rapes in prison are committed by heterosexual males against other heterosexual males. That's one of the first points that we cannot lose sight of, that sexual violence in prison is a lot like sexual violence outside of prison. It's about power, whereas they reduce it to, they look like women, therefore they're going to be more prone to sexual violence. And that's actually just not the case. And rape in prison is frequently as well, and the Irish Penal Reform Trust knows this. It's frequently meted out as a punishment for infringing some rule, getting on the wrong side of somebody, or also for a drug debt. Somebody who owes money to somebody in jail and doesn't pay. Well, what are you going to do with that person? How are you going to enforce your will within prison? One of the most demeaning ways you can do that is obviously sexual violence. They just ignore this. And like I say, people on the who don't work on the issue could be forgiven for not realizing that. But the Penal Reform Trust, if it is anything, it is an authoritative organization with a wealth of information at its fingertips. It didn't make a mistake on this issue. It threw the issue of prison reform under a bus. And the other thing they said, and this was sort of amazing, they said, transgender inmates in communal showers, they would be unwanted attention depending on their physical attributes. Now, let's remember, most trans never get operated in any sense of form. But Barbie Kardashian in a communal shower in Limerick prison, exactly how much unwanted or undesired attention would that generate? And it's also part of a myth that sexual assaults in prison are primarily in showers. This is part of the Hollywood narrative. It's not actually true. And again, the Penal Reform Trust knows this. Stats in Britain indicate that 4% of all sexual assaults, 7% of actual rapes occur in the showers and toilet facilities. The rest occur in the cell. The cell is the most dangerous place to be in a prison. And that's got to do with overcrowding. So instead of demanding an end to doubling up or even tripling up in cells, they decided, no, what we got to do is shift out these trans prisoners to a women's prison.
And obviously they're taking single cells each, so they are creating more overcrowding for the women, as well as the psychological impact of their presence on the women. You've done some writing for us for our blog, for the Countess blog, and what really struck me was when you talked about, because of your work with male prisoners, you can say with absolute authority about all the different populations that are vulnerable within the male estate. So can you tell me, what tends to happen to them and why trans-identified males are treated differently? You've said before, like, they don't get moved into the female estate. So can you tell me a bit about that?
Well, there's all sorts of prisoners are vulnerable. I mean, for starts off, openly gay prisoners, and the Penal Reform Trust sort of acknowledge this, and they latch to trans onto. Openly gay prisoners are just as vulnerable. Nobody would ever say that a gay man should be in a women's prison. It wouldn't. Not only would it not occur to the prison authorities, it wouldn't occur to the gay man to demand that they be transferred to a women's prison. Now, women's prisons tend to be smaller, and because they're smaller, they're safer, right? And also, the type of prisoner who's in a women's prison tends to be less violent, convicted of less violent crimes. Not to say that there are no.
Only 5% though. Only 5% are violent.
But it depends on the jurisdiction.
Yeah, but in Ireland, 95% it's just petty criminals, addiction, poverty.
But even here, for example, Colombia has a really high homicide rate. Over 20,000 men are in prison for homicide. It's only 746 women that are currently serving a sentence for homicide at the moment. And that's actually one of the things about the Irish prison system. When we're making decisions, and Fiona spoke about this just before, you need stats for policy. I can go onto the Colombian prison system's website now and pull up the stats and tell you how many people are currently in jail for a whole host of crimes. I can tell you by the crime. Yeah, you can't do that in Ireland. They don't know. They have no reliable stats of any nature, which is why actually, in the article that I wrote for the Countess website, I actually used British stats because they're comparable prison systems, but the Irish prison system just doesn't have the statistics there for that. But going back to your question about who's vulnerable, everybody's vulnerable in prison. The only people that are not vulnerable or are less vulnerable will be leaders of gangs, but even they run certain risks of violence. But in terms of, for example, in the United States, the US tends to produce from time to time fairly good prison report with good stats. So what do we know? We know that if you have a mental health problem, you're 2.5 times more like in youth facilities, for example, you're 2.5 times more likely to be victim of a sexual assault than if you don't have a mental health problem. If you have a physical disability, you're 1.5 times more likely to be a victim of a sexual assault than if you don't. So, this idea that trans are the most vulnerable is just nonsense. Now, trans prisoners can also have mental health problems. Trans prisoners can also have physical disabilities, right? They're part of that cohort. But they're actually a small percentage of the overall population outside of the prison, and they're just a small, and even in some cases, smaller percentage of the prison population. And the idea that you would change prison policy for such a small number of people, but you wouldn't change it for people who have mental health problems and physical disabilities. And it's been a long time demand of penal reformers that people with mental health problems should be housed in facilities that can deal with that. And a prison is not the ideal place for that. They missed an opportunity to make an argument for a different type of prison system.
And the Department of Justice in Ireland, with regard to this policy, talks about balancing the needs of trans-identified males with women, but we would argue there's no way to balance those needs. That they should not ever be housed in the women's estate. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I say, it goes back to this idea, which is a couple of centuries old, of separating men from women for the protection and well-being of women. Yeah. This is a basic idea, right? Which was not always the case. Women, even though this idea is a couple of centuries old, it's really in the 20th century that we begin to see this fully implemented in Europe, United States, and Canada. Where you get this segregation, and you get separation into individual cells, which was also, it was a new idea back 200 years ago. It was an invention, and it was done for the primary protection and well-being of the prisoner. And that's not the case anymore. We have, for example, there are lots of jurisdictions where prisoners are housed in barracks-like conditions. Or even here, we have, like the prison that I go into here, cells are designed for double occupancy. It's not doubling up. They're actually, that's the design. So there's no way you should be putting a man into such situations. And again, the primary concern is the protection of the prisoner. So what do you do with vulnerable prisoners in the male estate, for example? Well, there are wings in prisons for that. Sex offenders, for example, tend to be victims of violence from other prisoners. Right? There are particularly vulnerable cohorts within the prison population. So what happens to sex offenders? Well, sex offenders tend to be segregated from the rest of the prison population, which is not the same as solitary confinement. Solitary confinement, and it's important because I've seen this in part of the debate around what to do with trans prisoners. I've seen people saying, oh, well, lock them up in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement it's transitory. It's either meant as a punishment or as a temporary measure for protection. But the United Nations has defined solitary confinement over and above 15 days as torture. But segregation by category, that's not the same as solitary confinement. Not only can you do it, the Mandela principles on prisons allow for it. Explicitly, you can do this, you can segregate. And in fact, you should segregate prisoners by category. We're supposed to segregate prisoners by sex, by age, between sentenced prisoners and remand prisoners, which doesn't happen in Ireland. They're mixed in various jails. And you're also supposed to separate violent prisoners from non-violent prisoners, which doesn't necessarily mean a prisoner convicted of a violent offense. You might be convicted of white-collar crime, fraud, banking fraud or something, but you might actually be a very violent prisoner. And if you're identified as such, well, then you get moved out from a wing where you are with prisoners who are not violent. That's what you're supposed to do. It's called prison policy.
And in terms of what you've alluded to there, the different ways to separate you know, different factions or gang members as well, you know.
All the time.
Like the arrangement at the moment that is in place in Limerick is that those males who are, as we've said, and as we all know, both violent and they're all sex offenders. Well, 2 out of the 3 that we know about are sex offenders, and the third is violent. So they will have an arrangement in place where at any moment when they leave their cell, they have 2 prison staff with them at all times. Now we see very clearly that this is not scalable. You know, this cannot be scaled out for what will likely be more and more men, criminals who see that, you know, they would prefer to serve their time in the female estate. Like what Fiona said, you know, there is lots of research into in England whereby a huge number of Englishmen were identifying as Jewish in order to get better food. I mean, we would be very naive if we didn't think that criminals would do that. But that aside, whether or not their intentions are innocent or not, how do you feel about the security arrangement that's in place? And is there couldn't that just be done in the male estate? There's no reason to stop them putting trans-identified males in Mountjoy and just creating the same arrangements there?
Well, it is done in the male estate, particularly vulnerable prisoners or particularly violent prisoners. The prison authorities take greater care. I know from an experience with a prisoner in Jersey, actually, that they had 2 prison officers accompanying them around the male estate all of the time. You know, these type of things happen. The standard procedure, there is absolutely no need to put them into a women's prison. But when you're talking about the scalable thing, well, okay, we have 3 prisoners, so we can put 2 prison guards on them in the female estate. What do you do when the number of prisoners gets to 50 or 60 or 100? And given that Limerick prison actually has it's not even a women's prison, it's a section within a prison. What do you do when the numbers get to that scale? The same goes with the Docus unit, and it's interesting, of course, that they weren't put into the Docus unit, because the way the Docus unit is designed, it'd be really, really difficult to protect women from a male prisoner. The Docus unit was actually, when it was built, it was considered state of the art. It's actually, in its design and its concept, it's actually very progressive in terms of prison design and prison policy. If you were to put a man in there, because they're in houses, and the prisoners have huge amount of freedom, relative freedom, compared to other prisoners to move around that house and to move around the courtyard. It just couldn't be done. And, you know,
sorry to interrupt you there, but, you know, we do know that the first male who was sent to the female state, the first trans-identified male, was indeed sent to Docus in the first instance. And that is the same person who is now appealing their sentence on grounds of leniency. So the details of their case have now come out, and they were convicted. We always knew it was 10 counts of sexual offences, but it wasn't clear, and 1 count of child cruelty. And by joining the dots, maybe it was possible to guess that was with the same person, but it turns out they were abusing their stepson for years. So I think it's very chilling for all of us here today to be reminded that person was put in Docus in the first instance. I mean, that is how much of a nightmare this policy is for women and for children, because that person is obviously a predator and a paedophile.
Yeah, and you know, and to go back again to the Penal Reform Trust, one of the things that's always argued, there are various sex offender programs in prisons right throughout the world. You know, quite a lot of sex offenders don't take part in them. Yeah, they're not, but generally not obligatory anywhere. But if you have a sex offender who says they're a woman when they're a man, how do you do a sex offender program? Well, part of these programs is about recognizing what you did. Right? You have to take ownership of what you did and own up to it and acknowledge it. How do you do that? If you're a man who raped a woman, how do you do that when you're saying, no, I'm a woman? It undermines any of the measures that are there, and it also undermines preventative measures outside of prison, because there are programs in various parts of the world that try to identify people who are at risk of, particularly with children, risk of sexual violence or at risk of committing sexual violence. But you have to be able to talk about the reality of that crime in order to deal with it. And all those programs go out the window in a prison context if you are pretending that the sex offender concerned is a woman and not a man.
We're also concerned about the rights of the female staff in the female estate. You're probably aware, it was in the papers that there was a sort of a standoff recently in Limerick whereby a trans-identified male prisoner was thought to be carrying a weapon, a concealed weapon. And what happened was the male staff went to search him, they couldn't because they identify as female, and the female staff couldn't because obviously, like 95% of trans-identified males, they had a fully intact male body. So nobody actually searched that male body, and they did some kind of screening process instead. So that's obviously a breach of security, and it's not feasible long term. But our concern as an advocacy group for women would very much be a serious concern that those female guards will be forced to search those male bodies. If you look at other jurisdictions like Scotland, their actually female prison staff went on strike, but then the guidelines came down and they were forced to search the men whose preferred gender was female. So that is a great concern for us, and we would view that as a breach of the human rights of those prison staff.
Well, yeah, there's an actual former governor or governess of a prison in Scotland who's been quite vocal on this issue. One of the things that she pointed out, when you go into prison,
Rona Hotchkiss, yeah.
Yeah, one of the first things that happens when you go into prison, and this is universal, is you're strip searched. Right? Now you're strip searched normally by staff who are the same sex as you are. That's the norm. And in the Douglas unit, for example, and I was in when I did a report years ago, I was brought around and shown it, the male staff are not actually able to see what's going on there at the gate. There are some male staff in the prison, not many, but a lot of them are on the gate and security and that. They're not able to see this. There is a minimal protection given to what is a traumatic experience. And this governor, she said, it's a really traumatic experience. So what happens if it's a man that's been strip searched by a woman? But she actually pointed to something which is even more dangerous, I would think, right? That someday there will be a prison officer a male prison officer who identifies as female, and he will be allowed to strip search young, vulnerable women coming into the prison, right? And everything that we know about their vulnerability, the mental health problems, Fiona spoke about, a lot of female prisoners have already experienced sexual assault prior to going to a prison. And you go in then, and you're now going to be searched by a prison officer who's a man.
And actually, with that in mind, you're writing and research into Californian jails, where it's obviously an industry really out there, and prisons, people are imprisoned on an industrial scale. You're talking about a huge population. That's one of the things that has come to light from your research, that a huge amount of sexual abuse is happening at the hands of prison staff in those jurisdictions.
Yeah, I mean, the United States, and this is this is the other part of this, honestly, the Penal Reform Trust. The United States is unique in terms of prisons, in terms of the scale of violence, the level of violence. So when you quote figures about the United States, you do actually have to put that caveat in, that you're talking about an exceptionally violent prison complex. But it is indicative, you know, that in the United States, according to RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, they compile stats on on sexual assault and rape in general, not just on prisons. And most of the stats have nothing to do with prisons per se. But what they've found is that 60% of sexual assaults and rapes in prisons are committed by staff, which is unusual. That wouldn't be the case in Ireland or Britain. But that doesn't mean that no rapes in Britain or Ireland are committed by staff, because that is also clearly not the case. So, you know, you have a situation then, and also with the youth facilities, quite a high number of youths who are in youth detention facilities are sexually abused by staff members. You know, it's a common problem there. And it does exist, albeit to a lesser degree. We're not at the scale of the United States. Nowhere is at the scale of the United States in many aspects of prisons, but it does exist. So if you have a male officer entitled to strip search and to pat down, let's remember this, a female prisoner, the opportunities for abuse they're enormous, they're widespread.
The abuse might even happen in plain sight and not be obvious as well, because if you're talking about searching cavities or, you know, I mean, it's just a nightmarish vision, actually, I think, for all of us. I just wanted to ask you one last question. Sorry?
Even just a general leering at a woman who's stripping naked, doesn't actually have to physically touch her ever. For, you know, it's a form of abuse.
Yeah, I completely agree. Garoj, you have written for us, and I want to remind everyone here that your paper on the Californian prison system will be available on our blog, on our new website next week. And we look forward to reading that and publishing that for you. My last question is, and to do with your writing that you do for us, you've told me that before you sent me, you know, the manuscript, you considered whether or not you should put your own name to it, and that was remarkable because of all your decades of work with, you know, FARC rebels and gangs in one of the most dangerous countries in the world. So, can you tell me a bit more about that? About your hesitancy to put your name to that piece of work.
Well, I've written so far 6 books on my own authorship on the Colombian conflict, and I've contributed chapters to other books, and I've done reports on prisons here, which are unfortunately only available in Spanish. And I've written lots of articles. Even actually in one of my books, I named a leading politician here, Juan Jose Chavez, as the intellectual author, the man behind the murder of a journalist. Now, he's never been charged with that murder. He's never even been investigated for it. So it was quite daring to sort of suggest that he might be the culprit. My name's on the book. And in fact, the family of the journalist scanned that copy of the book and they sent it to the head of the police and said, look what this journalist has said. Why are you not investigating this politician? Never ever occurred to me never to put my name to a text here, ever, not once. But when I wrote the first document on the whole trans issue, I was kind of thinking, should I use a pseudonym? Should I just put it out there without a name? Now, I discounted the idea, but the fact was it actually went through my head. And the article that you're going to put up on the California, that was actually published in Spanish here first. And it's the only time it's on a website that I write for on a fairly regular basis. And the only time the editor of that website, anyone ever rang him to say, you should take that article down. I've written all sorts of stuff. I like to think my articles are good, but I'm sure some of them are not up to scratch and maybe should be taken down. This is the only time someone has actually said, get rid of this article. He stood his ground and said no. And he said, but I will give you a right of reply, which he did. The right of reply said that they were going to deal with my arguments and not insult me, and then proceeded just to insult me that I was white, I was male, I was cisgender, heteronormative, and a whole range of other things. And so I thought, oh, these people, they seem to know me better than I know myself, right? You know, that was the first time that's ever happened.
It's incredibly telling, isn't it? You know, the theme of this conference is resisting captivity, and that one anecdote of yours encapsulates perfectly what we talk about when we talk about captivity, that people feel cowed into submission and into groupthink around the dominant narrative. I just want to commend you so much for your bravery and integrity in speaking out, particularly as a former board member of the Irish Penal Reform Trust. Without doubt, there are other people in your cohort who feel the same way, but just feel unable to speak out. So we need people like you to do this, because without doubt, a critical mass will grow and things will change. Because after all, we live in a democracy. You know, we own this country, and these changes have been made in our names, but without our, you know, we weren't consulted. So thank you so much from all of us here today for your bravery and for a great chat, as ever.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I'm going to presume that if I move back to Ireland, the job with the Penal Reform Trust is off the cards.
Possibly, but hopefully by then everyone will have seen sense. If you want to put your the names of your books and your papers in the chat, and then the Countess team can tell people, because we're getting a lot of questions about your work. So if you want to type in.
The books are all in Spanish. There are articles in English, but the books are all in Spanish.
Well, maybe the articles, but we will be posting Garrod's article soon, and his research into California, where they've just mixed their jails. Thank you so much.
Jails here, by the way, are not mixed. Jails here are separate, yeah, and that's been the policy, and it's likely to continue to be the policy for the foreseeable future.
Is this in Colombia? Yeah.
Even though you can change sex here legally, since 2018, you can now redefine yourself as a woman should you see fit, and which has led to, there was one woman in jail for femicide.
So there actually are systems where self-ID or a form of self-ID exists, but where those males who feel they are female or identify as female are not placed in the female estate. So there are models out there.
Only 4 countries in Latin America don't allow some form of gender recognition certificate or change of sex, but only one of them, Argentina, allows mixing of male prisoners in the female estate.
Yeah, we want to try to hear from Argentinian activists as much as possible, because we feel like it was the first country, and there's a lot of pressure on people there to just shut up really and accept the new order. So yeah, it's difficult with the language barrier, but we do want to try and you know, build relationships with those activists. Garrod, thank you so much for joining us. An absolute pleasure. Gur míle mágad.
Okay.
Our final panelist needs very little introduction. She is an icon in the field. Her gender critical beliefs are not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Need I say any more? She writes with such logic and such clarity on single sex provision. And I've said this to her, I sometimes feel like when I read her writing, it feels like I've drank a long, cool glass of water. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to the conference Maya for starter.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Maya, how are you?
I'm good. I feel so honoured to be here. I'm a bit of a cuckoo in the nest. I have no Irish blood whatsoever. I have no English blood either. My parents are Jewish and American and Polish and Japanese immigrants to this country. So, and I haven't done many public appearances since the court case. I've written quite a lot, but I haven't done many events. I haven't done a lot of video or public events, and it's time to start doing them. So when you asked me, I thought this was a perfect thing to kind of start with, because it feels like we are, I think, reaching something of a tipping point in the UK, and hopefully that can sort of help others and help our nearest neighbour. So I'm really just delighted to be here and sort of tell my story and tell you what we're doing here, and the organisation Sex Matters, which we launched on Friday.
Yeah, before we get into the kind of the meat of the questions, there's no entry requirement for getting involved in the conversation in Ireland, and we're just very honoured to have you as one of the thought leaders. We do have, which is very heartening actually, some people just getting in touch and wanting to help us who aren't Irish at all. I mean, the vast majority of us are Irish living in Ireland, but some are diaspora, and then just women who care and can see what's happening in Ireland and want to help out. We had one member join us recently whose name was Maura, and I kept presuming she was Irish and kept telling her actually almost that she was Irish, saying, Maura is an anglicised version of Mora, M-A-I. And then eventually she kind of sheepishly said, no, it's Mara, I'm actually Spanish. So I was like trying to tell her she was Irish. And I was trying to pronounce your name earlier, wasn't I? Saying, how do I say this? Is it for start? And I was so conscious with an Irish accent I was going to say it the wrong way, but you told me it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly.
So I firstly, I think a lot of us will have come to know about your role in all of this and your activism through your case. I mean, I remember personally trawling through the paper and trying to find out more about this case, and it was very much a moment for me in my awakening about this whole issue about gender ideology. And I had this strange compulsion. I wanted to go and sort of pick it outside wherever the case was to support you. I just felt, gosh, women are being fired, Can you just talk us through the case, the timeline up to the case, and obviously it's ongoing because you are appealing, just so people are across, what happened?
Sure. So, so kind of my timeline, similar to Fiona's, I think, started really in 2017 when I first started to notice this issue. And the thing that I remember sort of pricking up my ears about was Jenny Murray, the BBC Women's Hour presenter, who had written an article in one of the newspapers saying, trans women are trans women, that's great, they should be able to live freely and be respected in their identity, but they're not women, it's not the same thing. And I'd read the article and thought, that sounds sensible. I didn't really know very much about the issue. And then, similar to kind of you wanting to pick it outside my case, then there was all of this furore over Jenny Murray, and she was cancelled from events and, pointed out as being this terrible bigot for writing something which seemed to be, common sense and humane to me. This is a story that we could tell many times with J.K. Rowling, with me, with, that there are so many versions of this story, but that was the first one that sort of made me notice that something wasn't what I thought it was. And, what I thought it was it's like gay rights, it's a human rights issue, it's straightforward, it's about acceptance and so on. And so I started paying attention, and I started paying attention on Twitter, and sort of, just reading things and following things. And it took me about 18 months of doing that before I felt confident in my own opinion, that I knew what I was talking about, that, that I wasn't misunderstanding, I wasn't a bigot, I was, I had concerns, particularly around the UK government at the time was proposing self-ID. And so it was sort of around September 2018, I kind of came out as gender critical. And I did it there was sort of, I got to the point of I'd been following women like Kathleen Stock, like Jane Clare Jones, like Posey Parker, and thinking, they're really brave. Yeah. And then I was thinking, well, if I think they're brave, why aren't I saying anything? And so I thought about the things that I could do, as myself. And I'm a researcher. I worked for international development think tank. I write for a living, I research for a living. But I'm also a mum, and I'm a scout leader, or I was a scout leader. And so I sort of started from where I was and sort of followed the relationships that I had. So I wrote to my MP, I donated to a crowdfunder, which is, you can do that anonymously. It was a sort of safe thing to do. I posted in my local mum's Facebook group, which got a reaction of, how dare you, you're a bigot, which was, the first time I'd really had that, and that was quite a shock. I wrote to the Scouts about their safeguarding policy, and I started to tweet. And the first tweets I wrote was I don't think I've spent so long writing 4 really boring tweets before. They were like, please read this consultation, read this article from Fair Play for Women, respond to this government consultation. It was the sort of safest and most careful tweet I'd ever written, and nothing happened. Nobody responded to it, and I had about 2,000 followers. They were policy people, they're empirical people who like to argue about issues and policies, and nothing. And and I was sort of getting angrier and wanting, it's eerie when people won't talk about an issue. And so I tweeted about Karen White, as that was happening at the time, the male prisoner who was put into the women's prison here and who sexually assaulted prisoners. So that was in the news. I tweeted about that, and still nothing. And so then I decided to try to ask my followers on Twitter a question that related to their own life, because I think people could see that, oh, this is a difficult issue, it's a controversial issue, you'll get in hot water if you talk about it, and I don't have to deal with this. Prison policy, someone else can deal with it. Even sports, somebody else can deal with it. And so in international development, where I work, lots of men have taken this pledge on, if they're invited to be on a panel at a conference and it's all men, that they will tell the conference organizers, no, I won't do a panel unless there's a woman on it. And so they either stand down or they can make the panel bigger or whatever. It's to say, there are women who know about things. And lots of the men in my field have sort of made this pledge publicly, and it's something that they're doing for women. And so it was the story of Pip's Bunce, which Fiona has already talked about. Pip's Bunce, a man who works at Credit Suisse, his name is Philip, and who goes to work on a Friday dressed in women's clothing and a wig, and is called Pips, and had been given this award for women in business. So I tweeted, if you were asked to be on a panel with Pip's Bunce, what would you do to my male followers? And that kicked off a conversation. So then there were about 200 tweets over the course of a few days, as you get these sort of running conversations, and people started to unpick the questions. What I wasn't really asking about Pip's Bunce. I was asking, what do you think a woman is, and do you think that policies that were developed to protect women should be flexed to accommodate men who want to identify as female all the time or some of the time? And I was really surprised by the responses I got from from guys that I worked with, or in the sort of broader networks, who are normally like, they're economists, they're scientists, they're not sort of fluffy people, and they were saying, well, if he feels like at least partly like a woman, then why wouldn't we accommodate him? So that sort of all happened in October, and I didn't know this at the time, but there were complaints in Washington DC. So the organization I worked for was a US think tank with a European arm, and I worked in London in the European arm. But there were a couple of women in Washington who they weren't even formal complaints. They were just, they were concerned about the fact that I was talking about this. And so I got a email saying, would you put a disclaimer on your tweets to say that they're not, all opinions your own? And so I said I would do that. And they said, we don't want to use exclusionary language. And my response was, well, definitions are exclusionary. You have, if you have a concept or a definition, it's going to exclude some people, because that's how language and concepts and statistics and understanding works. And I really thought at the time, I was working for this organization that had allowed people to have differences of opinion, that wasn't particularly pushing this agenda, and that does lots of work on women and girls in developing countries. So maternal mortality, early marriage, even birth certificates, the importance of birth certificates for children and for protection against child labor. I really didn't think that this would happen to me, and I partly felt like I was possibly a bit safe because I was in this organization that allowed you to have debate, and I found out that was not true. So over the course of about 6 months, there were sort of gradually bits of a job offer were taken away from me in a sort of slightly complicated way, so that at the end of the 6 months, the whole job had disappeared. This job that I'd been working on to develop a project where we'd been applying for funding, and when the funding came in, the job offer for me had disappeared. And so that was International Women's Day 2 years ago. I just lost my job. And I'd been working on an article. So this was kind of the first long form thing that I'd written about this topic, which was about how it related to international development organizations. I tweeted it for International Women's Day, and I wrote a thread. And in the thread, I said, I lost my job. And at that point, I didn't think I had any employment rights because I wasn't a full-time employee. I hadn't thought about bringing a case. And my dad had a very long court case, and I'd always swore that I would never sue anybody. So it just wasn't something that was on my mind. But I tweeted that I'd lost my job, and the feminist lawyers kind of arrived like the fairy godmothers, and said, you've been discriminated against because of your belief. And I mean, I hadn't even thought about this thing as being a belief. To me, it was, it's obvious that men are men and women are women. There are two sexes. You can't change sex. That's important in some situations. It doesn't have to impinge on the human rights of people who identify as transgender. And so I filed a claim to the Employment Tribunal, and it's a discrimination claim on the basis of belief. And so then I had to fund it because I have to pay the lawyers. So I started a crowdfunder in May of 2019. And that was probably the first time first time people had heard of me. Was I started the crowdfunder. We had the story in the newspaper, and raised £60,000 in 3 days, which was the fastest crowdfunder that the platform had that year at that point. And yeah, it was just amazing. I sort of spent 2 days sitting on my sofa in my pajamas, just watching, because you get comments coming in from people say, and lots of people like me, when I gave to a crowdfunder, you know, they were doing it anonymously. It's something that they could do to, you know, to support somebody who could speak out, mainly from women, but some men. And yeah, just amazing to kind of have that support behind you, to have thousands of people supporting you. And so
the judgment was quite shocking, actually. I think.
Yes, then the judgment. So then the case was about belief discrimination, and it's a preliminary hearing just on one piece of my case, which is the question of, is the belief that sex is real, immutable and important, a philosophical belief that deserves protection under the Equality Act? So as Helen said, there are 9 protected characteristics. Religion and belief is one of them, and it includes non-belief, so atheism, and it also includes non-religious beliefs. But in order to be protected, you have to show that your belief is coherent, serious, not it can be scientific, but it can't just be a sort of a piece of science that might be disproved tomorrow by another piece of evidence. It has to be a sort of fundamental truth, or something you believe is a fundamental truth. And it has to be worthy of respect in a democratic society, which means it mustn't undermine other people's fundamental human rights. And so the cases that have lost on this category are basically being a Nazi, or being a you know, a violent revolutionary who will overthrow the government. It's the bar is very low to get over for a view to be worthy of respect in a democratic society. And you know, we were, yeah, as you say, we were shocked when the judgment came out that this belief was judged not to be worthy, and we think that judgment is wrong, and it's going to appeal on the 27th and 28th of April. So hopefully it's going to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and they will look again at the judgment.
You know, in some ways, when there's an overreach with gender ideology, it is an own goal. Having said all that, though, because it brings it out into the sunlight, and obviously none of these arguments really stand up in the sunlight, or the theoretical framework as such does not stand up with any kind of rigor attached to it. But so I just want to say thank you from all of us for taking that case, and for all of the applicants taking all the different cases in the UK, because I'm sure that comes at a personal cost to do that to everyone in terms of time and just the emotional energy, but it does shine a light, so thank you so much. It's funny, actually, Anya Palmer put into the chat earlier when Fiona was talking about them, Philip Bunce deserves an award for enhancing so many.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's true. I think that's very true. We need to get an award to him, not Businesswoman of the Year, but you know. So you mentioned there at the beginning about your new organization. I mean, I've been following you and all your writing, but now you've put this all together with a view to activism around a specific part of this movement. And can you tell me a bit about that? It's just after launching, so just tell us the whole spiel about your
yeah. So Sex Matters, that's basically what we're about. It's a single issue campaign to re-establish clarity about sex in law and policy, language and culture. Initially focused on the UK, but as I say, I think, you know, if we can make headway on this in the UK, it's got to help others. I've co-founded it with Naomi Cunningham and Rebecca Bull, who are 2 lawyers, and with Dr Emma Hilton, who's a biologist who people may have, she's spoken at Fair Play for Women events. So a bit of science and a bit of law and activism, and it's aiming to connect the dots between all of the issues. So, you know, we have sex matters in schools, it matters in safeguarding, it matters in sports, it matters in prisons. And the way that sex self-ID has been brought in has, you know, has not been all of those things have been connected, and yet we're kind of playing whack-a-mole in trying to deal with them. So I think we need a campaign that will bring all of that together, that will support the organisations that are already doing things, but will also kind of join the dots, and will also bring in men, you know, people who are concerned about this for freedom of speech reasons, people who are concerned about governance, about good governance and decision making. You know, it's not only feminists or radical feminists who this matters for. You know, it matters for everyone. It matters, you know, if you're a father or a you know, a parent. Obviously it matters more for women, but I think ultimately it matters for anybody who cares about government and democracy. And so that's what we want to do. We're non-partisan, and we're going to work with everybody. And we launched on Friday, but we've been sort of going behind the scenes since before Christmas, putting in submissions to the various government consultations, starting to engage with policymakers, and with journalists and with experts, and you know, sort of being part of that debate. So that's yeah, that's Sex Matters.
I think that's so true what you're saying about you know, this movement. Obviously it's powered a lot by feminists, and a lot of radical feminists as well, because of the framework, but I completely agree with you. You know, we always say that at the Countess, that what we have in Ireland is a reordering of society. You know, we now have a sex class called women, which includes some men who identify as women, and that is a fundamental restructuring, reordering of society at its most basic core. And we weren't asked if we wanted this to happen. And I completely agree with you. This is about a democratic deficit. You know, who's making these laws? Who is pushing for them? People aren't even aware of what they do. And I completely agree, when they find out what they do, that any man at any time can fill out a form. And in our law, it's for all purposes. They change their sex for all purposes.
Yeah.
Which means they can access all of those spaces that you just described. And of course, you know, I think it's very true that 9 out of 10 people don't agree with that, you know, and it's about those people feeling empowered to speak out. And going back to your point about definitions as well, that's always been one of my issues. When I was trying to get my head around gender ideology at the beginning, and I was thinking, but you know, everything is so circular, you know, it's the theoretical framework is so wishy-washy. It's all based on feelings. We can't legislate based on feelings. That's just bad law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about actually toilets, because when I founded the Countess at the very beginning, I was given advice not to go near them, don't talk about them, they're not interesting, it's really reductive, people don't really care. And I do understand how, like in America, obviously the whole toilet wars, the bathroom wars, they probably don't call them the toilet wars, bathroom wars, and they talk, you know, they say, oh, we just want to pee. And so yes, it can be quite reductive, but I actually disagree with not going there. I think it's almost, we have to hold this line. I think it's almost, you know, I fundamentally think that women and girls need, require and deserve and require their own toilets. And actually, it's almost the most insidious creep in a way. Like, it costs nothing. It's a few minutes to just change the sticker on the door to gender neutral. And in just, you know, in a second, you've obliterated that single sex provision for women. Can you tell me a little bit about your research in this specific area?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think, you know, this redefinition of the language of men and women is, you know, is such a huge and fundamental thing. And as you say, it was done without consultation, you know, without consultation about what it would mean, and it's been presented as being, it's just admin, or it's just about being compassionate. And so, you know, we have in the UK, the Gender Recognition Act is also for all purposes, and you look at the discussions that took place in Parliament when they were putting that through, and they sort of said, well, you know, there are so many laws that mention sex or mention men and women, and we can't consider each of them. So let's just say for all purposes, because it's neat, you know, we don't have to think about all of those different times when sex is mentioned in the law. And I think what's happening now is you do have to, it's the Chesterton's fence idea. If you have a law or a boundary that was put up for a reason, before you take it down, you have to understand what that boundary was put there for. And so when you think about for all purposes, what does that mean? And that does, it does mean prisons, but I think, it does also require that we think about toilets. And so we started this because the government here is did a call for evidence through the Ministry of Communities and Local Government about toilets for men and women. And the consultation was asking partly about gender neutral toilets, but also about signage and rules around toilets. And even the consultation talked about gender, didn't talk about sex. And so, the first thing in our response was, this is what sex means in biology. This is what sex means in the law. This is why, if you say gender, you're already confusing things. You're already making it difficult to say what it is that you're giving away. And so that's sort of the first bit of our response. And our response to this consultation ends up running to 60 pages, which they probably weren't expecting quite so much, but we thought we'd take the opportunity to write down everything about toilets, because, as you say, I think it's the one topic that people don't want to go too close to, because I think people come into this issue and they can see that there are big problems in that, there are issues in sport, there are issues in prisons, but toilets seems like an area where nobody wants to get into a conflict. And we're told it's fine. Trans women have been using women's toilets forever. Nobody's complained. Why are women complaining now? And I think there's two things. One, that's not true. So if even Stonewall has done does these surveys, and they find that I think it's 46% of transgender people in their surveys say they don't feel comfortable going to the toilet, and I think 36% say they've been discriminated against in a cafe or a bar or a public place. It doesn't say what it means by discriminated against, in terms of, does it mean not being able to go to the toilet you want to, or not being allowed in at all? But trans people are feeling uncomfortable, women are feeling uncomfortable. So if you ask in a survey of men and women what do they think about trans women using women's toilets, I think it's around 50% will say yes, and it changes with age. So the older women are more likely to say no, younger women are much more likely to say yes. But if the survey is made clear, what does trans woman mean in this question? It means somebody who may not have had any surgery, have no intention of having surgery. Then the numbers go down. So then you get around 30% of people say yes, I'd be comfortable, or trans women should be allowed to use women's toilets, but 70% are saying no. And I think, as you said, it's, even if some women are willing to say you can pee next to me, that doesn't mean they can give that away for other women. So I think toilets is really important. We do have to go there, and it's not rocket science. What we need for toilets is clear rules that everyone understands, so people understand where they're allowed to go and where they're not, and who they might come into contact with there. And those rules are going to be the same for toilets, showers, gyms, changing rooms. And the obvious solution is to have a unisex option. So if people don't feel comfortable for whatever reason using the same sex facilities for their own sex, there's a unisex option where no one's going to ask questions, where they don't have to it's not a comment on their gender identity or their passing. It's just a place where everyone gets to have privacy. So I think we need to move away from thinking toilets are a test of the authenticity of someone's gender identity and their acceptance. But if you look back in the history of how this all happened, that's what doctors have pushed. Doctors set people with gender dysphoria, people who are seeking transition. That was one of the tests that they set them to say, go out and use the women's toilets and see if you get challenged. See, you know, they sort of set it as if it was like a jungle. Go and explore this you know, uncharted territory, and see if you can prove yourself. And you know, women never consented to being you know, the test subjects for people's gender identity. And I think it particularly gets pushed into workplace toilets. So work and you know, we have men and women's toilets. It's not just by culture or by tradition, it's by law. So employers have to provide toilets and changing, you know, if they need changing facilities for employees segregated by sex. So do you know, pubs, clubs, all of those kind of restaurants, cafes, licensed venues all have to provide men and women's toilets unless they are unisex. So if you have a single room, closed room with a sink that's like, you know, like your toilet at home, then that can be unisex. But if you have a bank of cubicles and a bank of cubicles and urinals, that's separate. And workplaces are required to provide that. And workplaces are the place where people who transition are using, you know, being told by their doctors that that's the test of whether they are transitioning, is whether they're allowed into the women's toilets. But
so with so much of this, we just see a complete lack of regard for women's you know, how women feel about any of these changes, you know, not even considered, you know. It's extraordinary, isn't it, really?
Exactly. And kind of women in prisons and women in the workplace are the captive audience. You know, you're required by the rules to comply, and you know, and girls in school. So if the institution says we are letting males into this space, it's very difficult in those situations for women and girls to say no, whereas in a pub or you know, a public place, they can leave. And now you're seeing policies being set by workplaces that say the minute a person says I'm planning to transition, they should be allowed to use whichever toilet they choose. And so then it's not even the original point of it, which was to test whether somebody socially was accepted, has been stripped away, because there is no chance for the female colleagues to do anything but be socially accepting, because if they don't, their job's at risk.
And similarly, girls in a school where, you know, I mean, in every country we see the same methodology. We see the Trojan horse of anti-bullying in schools, and we see diversity training in the workplace. But with schools, you know, we always think, well, the guidance is that that girl who feels uncomfortable should be separated and re-educated. I mean, so it's quite an aggressive way to push this ideology and to force young women especially to ignore their instincts, you know, that keep them safe, and to be scolded and told that those instincts are that instinctive reaction is you being a bigot, you know, you being conservative.
And you know, it's one thing, it was hard enough for me to stand up to this as a, you know, as a grown woman, as a mother, you know, as someone who's been around the block a few times. But for young girls, you know, to have to say, I don't accept this, I think is really impossible. And the law doesn't require it. You know, that's the thing. They're being sold this policy by lobbying institutions, and often by the government itself. So, you know, by the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Government Equalities Office, whose job it is to look after everyone, you know, whose job it is to communicate the law, which, you know, we have quite a decent law that should protect everyone with all those characteristics, like Helen said, and is not doing that. Is using the Equality Act against women and girls, against their boundaries. And so that's what we want to challenge, and give people the tools to understand the law and to use it, you know, in their workplaces, in their schools.
One of our concerns actually is that if, and this is, it's important to add actually that this is already signed off in our legislative programme for government. So it is likely to be pushed through without very much legislative pre-leg scrutiny. And that is an amendment to our own, which is slightly different in Ireland, but to all of our equality legislation to include gender identity as a ground. And our very grave concern and fear would be that that would be used, you know, it'll be impossible for me as a mother to accost a man who walks into the ladies' toilets when I'm there with my little girl, because that would be to discriminate against him if he identifies as female. So it could do away with the need for certification at all, even though the system of self-ID in Ireland, there is no medical gatekeeping anyway. There's no criminal or legal gatekeeping. No one has ever been refused. And obviously, as we've discussed plenty already, men in the middle of live rape trials and trials for sexual offences are granted these certificates. But this would be a further step where just by someone's say so, in terms of their identity, that identity would be protected.
And I think, I mean, sorry, can I?
Yes.
In the UK, we, you know, only about 5,000 people have a gender recognition certificate. It was intended to be for this very small group, and to date it has been a quite small group. But it's got, I don't know if you have this in Ireland, but it's got this very strong confidentiality protection, so that if somebody has a gender recognition certificate, it becomes a criminal offence for somebody who's found that out through the course of their job, to then share that information. And you know, the problem with that is, if somebody has a birth certificate that says they're female and the person can see that they're male, then they have that information, because, you know, you can't change sex, and often people can tell. And so then you've made the question, what sex are you, such a dangerous question to ask anybody, because you've given, you know, ordinary, you know, an 18-year-old receptionist on the gym at the sports centre asking a question which may become a criminal offence, to then deal with the information. So then they go, well, we're not going to ask anybody's sex, we'll just say gender because it's safer. So even though we don't have self-ID, and even though only 5,000 people have changed their sex, it's already been, because of this confidentiality, it's been sort of scratched from all policies and public life.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of you know, hard days in this movement, but I have to say, I think I speak for all of us when I say we were all pretty elated when we watched the House of Lords amendment to the maternity bill in England. It was just so wonderful to see so many men and women stand up and speak up for women and for mothers, in particular. In Ireland, you know, language is so important, and we've talked about that a lot today. But of all of our pillars of concern as a advocacy group, language is the one that has flared up quite a lot. It's very much a live issue in Ireland, and the reason is for specific historical reasons, that we have an ongoing cervical cancer screening scandal, and then a follow-up, a cover-up, and women were basically given false negatives, and they're now going through the courts. They've been dragged through the courts, and many of them have small children, and they're dying, and hundreds were affected. And that very same screening, National Health Service, our health executive, quietly dropped the word women from that screening listure, from that service. And naturally enough, there was outcry, and then they put it back on, but they've dropped it again. They don't seem to be acting in good faith in terms of what we are requesting. But the outcry was because, you know, it was very raw. And I think similarly with the word mother, I think people just feel they experience it as an assault to women to take the word mother from them, and to humanity, because we're all born from mothers. So can you tell us a bit about your briefing, the background, the briefing that you gave the House of Lords?
So, you know, this, as I said, it's like whack-a-mole, that
Yeah.
that self-ID is being pushed into any law, you know, because so many laws do recognize sex, there are so many places to push it into. So hate crime, um, you know, building standards, and so it got pushed into this law that was being passed, which was about maternity leave for ministers, for government ministers, because they don't have the same coverage as ordinary employees. And basically, this law would cover one minister who is pregnant and about to give birth. So it was quite urgent. And the reason it will only cover one minister is they will update it. They're going to add, you know, potentially adoption leave and paternity leave. So this law is really only kind of an emergency measure for this one woman who is about to give birth. And so it was being pushed through the House very quickly. And the first thing we saw of it, you know, somebody said to me, it doesn't say woman in it, and it doesn't say mother in it. It says pregnant person and person who has given birth. And, you know, this is in the context of women's charities talking about cervix havers, you know, birth charities talking about, you know, birthing people and menopausal people, and, you know, people who menstruate, as J.K. Rowling pointed out. And so we had not a very long time to respond to this, and it, you know, was presented as being, well, it's this very small bill, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't matter very much, it's really only for this one woman, and why are you making such a fuss about it? But we thought we would, and so we spoke to legal professors, you know, people who know about drafting. And so what had happened was, when this bill was put forward, the government said, we can't use the word woman because of a policy that was put in place in 2007 on gender neutral drafting. They said, Parliament, we're not able to use the word woman in relation to maternity leave, which seemed a bit odd, because there are lots of laws that use the word woman in relation to maternity leave. And so we talked to the professors of legal interpretation who kind of pointed us at this policy, which was brought. There is a policy on gender neutral drafting, and it was brought in because before that, all the laws used to say he, you know, or you talk about the chairman, or, you know, everything was written in terms of he, and it was understood that that included women, but that they used he as the default person. And so in order to change expectations and culture, they had decided to use gender neutral language, to talk about the person who, and to not use pronouns in laws in 2007. But even in the guidance on that, they said where it relates to a job that can be done by a man or a woman. And clearly, being pregnant, giving birth is not a job that can be done by a man or a woman. It's a job that can only be done by a woman. And so we put together a briefing explaining this, and also explaining there was a case in the UK over the last couple of years of a trans man, so a woman who identifies as a man, who'd gone through the gender recognition certificate process, so is legally says male on the birth certificate, had then gone for fertility treatment, so artificial insemination, in order to get pregnant, gone through the pregnancy, had a baby, did not want to be named as a mother on the birth certificate, wanted to be named as the father. And this person had gone to court to say, it's my right not to be the mother, but to be the father. And that's gone through, it's gone to the Court of Appeal, and it's due to go to the Supreme Court. But so far, the courts have said, no, the person who gives birth to a child is the mother. And the reason why is because it's because of the child's right. It's the child's right to know who gave birth to them. And it's the child's right to have somebody who is responsible for them at the moment of they come into the world. You know, the father may not be there. He may or may not be there, but the mother is there. Physically, the mother is there. And you know, now you have egg donation and so on. The mother may not be the biological mother, usually 99 times out of 100 she is, but she is there. She's physically the person who's carried that child for 9 months and given birth to them. And if there's any decisions to be made about that child after the moment of birth, that's her responsibility, that's her domain.
Legally, isn't it?
Yeah, legally it is. And so to sever that link between a mother and a child at birth in order to satisfy a person's gender identity that they didn't want to be named as mother, the court said no. And you know, when they brought the Gender Recognition Act in, they never thought that somebody who feels so strongly that they don't want to be a woman would also want to go through pregnancy and birth. They, you know, so like when they said for all purposes, they didn't think through what that means in relation to biology carrying on. So we wrote a briefing that explained about that and explained about gender neutral drafting, and we shared it with the MPs and with the Lords, and they appreciated it. And particularly in the House of Lords, a sort of debate kicked off that had not happened before, and it was about this word woman and mother. It was about this bill, but it was like a plaster had been ripped off, and the Lords who hadn't spoken about this before talked about women losing their jobs. They talked about rape crisis centres being defunded because they were women only. They talked about the abuse and hatred that's been heaped on people like J.K. Rowling, Rosie Duffield MP, who's spoken up about this. So they sort of started with this one word and this one very small bill, and they talked about everything, and it feels like Pandora's box has been opened a bit, and it's not going to go back in. So we need to keep building on that momentum and making it safe for people to talk about this and to recognize what everybody knows.
And I think there's something powerful about something being said in the same way that if something is said in open court or is in a judgment, there's a real power to that in terms of the public sphere. Likewise, if the Lords speak, and as they did so eloquently. And I also have a theory. I think, a lot of people, their gateway to this movement is free speech, and then they may have different levels of engagement with the feminist, with the they may or may not, if they're not women and they're not feminists, they may not particularly care about our safe spaces, or it may not even occur to them, but they might really be prepared to die on the hill in terms of free speech. But I think personally that I think the word mother is one of those kind of gateway things as well. I think it really does impact people for that very reason. It's, the kind of the proto relationship. It's where we all come from. And I think it is one of those things that will push the conversation more out into the mainstream for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we have all these stupid discussions on Twitter, and one of them is like, what's the definition of woman? And the one we say is it's about, or female is about producing large gametes, and that sounds like this really obscure, weird scientific thing. Large gametes are eggs, small motile gametes are sperm. It sounds so obscure, but having the type of body that produces large gametes affects girls from the day of birth, but certainly from puberty, all through their adult life. And it's that's what it takes to be a mother. Not every woman is a mother, but every mother is a woman, and everybody had a mother and came from that. And if our laws can't reflect that and support that most fundamental relationship to human survival, then they're no good.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think we sever the link between the child and the mother, in language and in law at our peril, really. But thank you so much for talking to us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Having me.
Thank you, Maya. And
good luck with everything.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to have a Q&A to the entire panel. So if the panel would like to unmute, that would be great. I'm going to have a look at some questions. I don't know if you can see the questions there. So let's see. Oh, there's loads of, oh, the Countess team have been answering them. Okay, let's see how many are open. Lots of answered questions. Can everyone in the panel hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mona, you're there.
Yep.
Okay, brilliant. Gillian Kelly said, it seems such an own goal for women to sign up and believe in self-ID. Why would any woman agree with this? What is the psychology behind it? Is it simply female socialization that will always center men? Is that the reason this has happened? That's not to any particular panelist, to anyone who would like to answer.
I mean, I have some theories that I had to try and work through for the book.
Yes.
And I think to some extent, I think it's kind of appealing, this idea that we're liberated from our bodies. And women don't like the idea that we're just, you know, walking uterus on legs, or that, you know, I mean, you have to accept reality if you want to protect women. Yeah. But especially before women become mothers, or if they're not going to become mothers, their friends are at the age that they become mothers, it can be kind of easy to buy into the idea that we are all something like, you know, a meat sack with a ghost in it, or whatever, you know, analogy you want to use. Like some people say, like, you know, walking computer on legs or something. You can believe that your body doesn't tie you down and doesn't mean very much until you hit that bedrock reality of growing another human being and pushing it out, or seeing your friends do that, or being treated badly at work when you thought all of that was sorted and you just thought people were complaining about nothing, you know. So there's this psychological thing of wanting to be, you know, limitless, formless, women of the world, all these lovely things that idiots like unwomen, as I call them, the UN women, say. So I think there's that. There's denial. There's genuinely not understanding what people are talking about. Women become radicalized in their midlife. And then we actually mostly have sex segregation at the moment, de facto, where it matters. I mean, we're losing it, but we have it. So you can pretend to yourself, for example, that women are weaker. Like, lots of women think it's quite unfeminist to say that women are physically weaker than men in sport. I've had people say that it's unfeminist of me to say that women are weaker. It's just fact. And so when you see athletes saying, oh, I can take any man on, well, that's because they've never had to. Come on. You know, so it's easy to say it when you never have to. You'll know if you're put in the ring or in the pitch with a man that that's ridiculous, but they mostly aren't. So they're my theories for the moment.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think as well, when feminism reduced itself to workplace equality and pay gap feminism, it kind of disappeared our biology actually as well. So then we have a whole generation who don't even think about or acknowledge male pattern violence, the structures that we live within, and our biology, the bodies that we experience the world through.
Sorry, I should have said live fem, of course, as well. Like, developments in academia and developments in feminism have actually been extremely harmful for women.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons I think a lot of women in this movement no longer call themselves feminists, for that reason, to move away from that. So just have time.
And it's no coincidence that Mumsnet has been the sort of bedrock of the resistance in the UK, because you know, as Helen said, I think young women, you don't know what you don't know, and then you become a mother, and then you're outside of all of those political and workplace networks that you were in before. And Mumsnet sort of brings together this amazing brain trust of women who've sort of had the scales removed from their eyes, of, you know, of thinking the world was a lot more equal than it really is.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think myself and a lot of my friends and my sisters all had that existential moment where your partner goes back after paternity leave and you can't even go to the loo because you've got this tiny baby, and you just think, how did this happen? I've gone through some kind of wormhole back to the 1950s. I thought I had this completely like equal existence, and it is true. It is motherhood. I think there's no coincidence that Mumsnet is the radicalizing kind of gateway. I have another question here. Are the panel more or less hopeful that 6 months ago that we can regain the ground? Can we regain the ground, and can we get our boundaries back and our rights? And is this different in the US compared to in Europe? Is that?
I mean, I'm hopeful, but not fast,
Yeah.
especially in places that laws have changed. And I think the US, it's all tangled up with politics in the US and polarization. And I mean, America has a dismal record in resolving really tricky public policy problems. It's not the first one. Things like healthcare and gun control, you know, and they're still arguing about abortion. So once things end up in these, you know, America paints itself into political corners, and then you can't see how to get out. Like, once there are more guns than people, how do you do gun control? Well, now you can't, you know. So I'm a bit afraid that they're going to paint themselves into a corner on this one, and it's just going to be another of the terrible, terrible things that America has got badly wrong. Everybody else has resolved, and they haven't, and they can't.
And of course, it's very difficult for women out there because it's so polarized. You're either pro Biden's EO or you're, you know, against reproductive rights for women. It's really tricky for them. Any more questions?
Yeah, well, I would just say for the UK, though, I mean, I totally agree with Helen, but for the UK, I'm starting to feel a bit more optimistic.
Good.
You know, I think we're starting to see the change. I just did some analysis the other day of donations to crowdfunders and how the ones we've run 4 now, Fair Play for Women, and we've always had the majority have been anonymous, and it's only shifted a tiny bit. So it went from 57% of donations were anonymous to 52% end of last year. And even for the £100,000 that we just raised for the ONS case, still half of them are anonymous. And if you contrast that with other issues, even things taking on the UK government or complaining about the Chinese government or complaining about your own local authority, where you could understand someone might not want to put their name, not the same proportion of anonymity at all. So we are still being silenced, but I see a shift. I think it's shifting. I don't know what Helen and Maya think.
Completely agree. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but by having held the legal line, you know, now you can start to use the law in your favor and force people like Stonewall back out of businesses, hopefully. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's so much easier somewhere that the law hasn't been changed.
However, to end on an optimistic note, I have to say that on the ground in Ireland, we are seeing a huge shift in the kind of the discourse. The Overton window has moved from "there's nothing to see here, everything is bedded down beautifully" to "oh, there is disquiet, there are groups, there are concerns." And I think bit by bit there will be in time analysis of in a substantive way about our concerns. And also, it seems like a small thing, but I think it's highly significant. More and more women are using our hashtag. I've got a really nice little bit of merchandise here. We will be heard. Can you see this, everyone? Oh, it's blended.
Oh, no.
But they're saying we will be heard in their bios with their real names. And I think that is quite significant. You know, people are feeling, you know, that they can speak up. So I did promise everyone a little treat. And I'm now going to unveil that little treat. An amazing woman who is a singer-songwriter is going to, I'm going to have a chat with her and then she's going to sing us out. But before I do, I just want to, I've been told to remind people of our YouTube channel. We need to get subscribers. We need to basically beat the algorithms, don't we all? So we need to get more subscribers so that we can brand it as the Countess. And we are going to start having merchandise. This is a nice little face mask. And I don't know if you can see this, actually. I have to stand up. Can you see I'm wearing our logo. I think I've been hiding it all day. But so we are going to have merchandise. We're very proud of our brand and our inspiration, our figurehead. But without further ado, I want to thank everyone for coming here today. This was a momentous occasion for everyone here in the movement in Ireland. Really appreciate you giving us your time, to our wonderful panelists. And yes, it's really important to remember that we live in a democracy and our voices matter. And our figurehead, Countess Markievicz, went to her first ever political meeting when she was 41. So it is never too late to change the course of history, the course of your country. And I believe we can do that together. But let me introduce our next.
First, Alicia, let us do you a boulibus.
Thank you. Now, I'm just trying to see if our guest is here. Oh, there we are.
And I've enjoyed I feel so honoured to be coming in on off the back of so many groundbreaking. Just I've learned so much of every single one of you along this. It's been a year. It's only been a year that I've been gender critical. Whatever it is I'm doing, it's been a year I've been doing it, and I've learned so much from all of you.
How did you first get involved? So, you know, we've found your singing and your thinking and your writing and your, dare I say, altercation with a certain singer, all very compelling, all of it. But just tell us firstly how you got involved with.
Well, I kind of, listening back to Maya speak, I've kind of realised a piece of the puzzle that I've been missing when I was kind of putting it back together. So like 3 years ago or so, I've only been doing music for 2.5 years now. So 3 years ago, I used to work full-time in restaurants for a chain of restaurants. I was a company trainer and used to travel around the UK opening restaurants. That was what I did. And then something kind of groundbreaking happened. My mum got diagnosed with breast cancer and it shook my world. It literally, she's absolutely fine. She's had the all clear. We're all good. But it just, my mum's my rock, and it shook my world. And at that point, I quit and started doing music. So I'd been doing music for a year or so. This whole time, my mum had been talking to me about women's rights. And like women's rights have always mattered. Like, this is something that I think is interesting. My logo, if you can see, it had the female symbol in it way before I'd got involved in any, like, I just like women. This is what I did. And me and my mum had been kind of coming to heads about it. And this is an analogy. What to me it sounded like, my mum saying trans women are men at the point, you know, sort of a year ago, to me was like saying adopted children are biologically not. It would be like going out and campaigning. It's true, but it's hurtful. Like, adopted children aren't biologically related to their parents, but what would be the need to go out and shout that? Like, why would anyone? It just, I couldn't see any angle that this was reasonable for anyone to be campaigning against. Like, it just sounded bigoted. That's where I was at. Never thought my mum's been a bigot. She's the kindest, and I just couldn't understand it. Like, so we kind of agreed to stop talking about it. But I'd had enough sort of information put in to my ear that I'd argued against, you know, trans women will make women work harder. If I was an athlete, I'd be happy to compete against men to prove that women are stronger than men. I was coming out with all of it. And then one day, out of nowhere, on Instagram, I'm just randomly having a conversation about Johnny Depp, something or other, and someone was annoyed with my feminist view and said, "You're not a woman or a female." And I thought about it. If I wasn't on my period at that moment, it wouldn't have gone the way it did. But I said, "Well, can you tell that to my uterus, because it's really grieving me right now?" Purely, like, wasn't like I would never be transphobic. I think if I knew it was transphobic before I said it, I wouldn't have said it. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, so I said, "Tell that to my uterus." It just, one thing after another, people were like, "Oh, so you're a bigot?" And I'm like, "Whoa!" And I was like trying to undo what I'd done. And I read it back and I thought, you know what? If I'm a TERF, then I'm a TERF. Yeah. I look back, that was the 2nd of February last year. And I'm a massive Harry Potter fan. So I'm a massive Harry Potter fan. So my first in to getting information on this was actually like a crash course, because I went and looked at JK's tweet. And then the first thing I looked into was Maya's, what was happening. And to me, really, looking back, that's quite a big place to start. Do you know what I mean? Like, I started at the legal side of it, which I'm not political, I'm not legal. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, and then bit by bit, it took a month for me to come out and say, it took a month of thinking, of making sort of links in my head, to come out and tweet my first. And Debbie Hayton, I saw Debbie's tweet underneath J.K. Rowling's tweet, and that led me down a path of, okay, maybe I'm not a bigot. That was like maybe I'm not a bigot.
Once you see, you can't unsee, isn't it?
It's just one thing after another. It just, and it was the medicalising children. And I thought, I had to make a choice. And it really was a choice of, like, my music career or women. And it literally, I'm lucky that I chose to busk, because no one can stop me doing that. It's, you know, I can go out and do that anywhere, at any time. No one can cancel that. And I thought, you know what? It's what have I got? My career, or speak for the wrongs that are happening. And
you've done some writing about your personal, story in terms of your background, specifically, and how you viewed the appropriation of womanhood to be exactly the same as the appropriation of, for example, blackness. If I decided
Absolutely,
to identify
yeah.
as a Black person. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So I don't know if visually, I think maybe I look sort of, some people thought I was Spanish, some people I'm kind of ethnically sort of ambiguous, but my dad is half Black, we think, because he was adopted. We're not 100% sure. And I wasn't brought up by my biological mum. I was brought up by my dad initially on his own. We moved to Trinidad. I met my mum, who I called mum's side of the family, my stepmom in Trinidad. She came back to England with us. So I was raised, me, my sister, and 2 Black parents in a very Black area.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad, because he was adopted, he's got real sort of issues with his own race, I think. And I think he had children with a white woman and wanted them to come out Black. And we're not Black, do you know what I mean? I'm named after an African woman, and we had to refer to ourselves as Black around my dad. If we referred to ourselves as anything, I only ever had Black dolls. I wasn't allowed to play with white children. I wasn't allowed, it was, if you ever bring a white boy home, I was Black, I had to be Black. And then when I moved away from my dad and kind of looked at myself and what my own identity, I started to realize that my whole life I'd felt inferior because I wasn't Black enough, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, the easy out would be, I guess, to do what Rachel Doziel did. And I could quite easily I could tan up more, I could perm my hair more, I could present Blacker than I am. It's such a hard conversation to have because it's all about identity. But I know, and this is someone who grew up Black. I've watched people, my dad's got dreads, people used to come and touch his hair. He's been in I watched my dad have physical fights because someone, when I was growing up, my little brother, who's not physically related to me, but we grew up together, he's from Trinidad, he's full Black, and someone spray painted Kyle is a N-word on the fence, and I hunted that kid down and I fought him. He was a boy, he was my age, and I physically had a fight with him at 15. I know what racism is, I know culturally what Black means, and to me it would probably make my life easier, and I feel more validated if I walked around the world and people knew I was Black, people knew I wasn't white. But I wouldn't do it because even though I'm a quarter Black, I can still see that if I can walk around shops and not get accosted or not get followed the same way as I would with my dad or my little brother or my stepmom, do you know, then for me, I can't say I understand the struggles of, I can say I've seen the struggles of a Black person, and maybe trans women from a point of view that are passing or whatever can see the struggles of a woman, but that doesn't mean you understand them and you feel them. And why would you want to do that? I don't, and that's the part for me I've really struggled with. If I can't identify as Black, being part Black, having Black family, my name is African, and I'm not Black, I'm not white, I'm neither. That's fine. What is it?
And the world is, justifiably outraged when a white person.
I'm not white, and if I identified as Black, it would be offensive. I know it would. I know it would. If I said I'm a Black woman and this is my opinion, it would cause uproar, and I'm tempted to do it, but it's, do you know, I mean, just to prove a point, oh, so I can't be Black, even though this is my dad. I can show you a picture of my dad. Is he Black? Okay, so I'm not Black, but this is a woman.
But under gender ideology, of course, any man can say he identifies as a woman and be accepted in all of her spaces, places, lists, sports. It's really important to remember that there is not a lot of logic attached to any of this.
No.
But you've written a beautiful song, which you're going to sing us out with.
I am, yeah. I'm so honoured to do this. I wrote this song. I don't want to be sort of inflammatory with my music. I want to make beautiful music. The Billy Bragg thing, I thought it would slip past with 20 odd likes. Honestly, I thought this was something I'm doing for me. He's hurt my feelings, and I'm just going to sillily rewrite it. I didn't put any thought, and that I was like, whoa, okay. And I realised music has a place in this, and so I wrote this song just to say thank you to the women. I've spent a year learning on a crash course of real feminism when I thought I was a feminist. I thought I was fighting for I've had a crash course on how to fight for women, and so I wrote this song for that.
And is there anyone you'd like to dedicate it to?
Yes, so I've done quite a lot of research into the Countess, into Constance Markovic.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. And I think I relate to her. She made a choice to go from riches to rags. And I wasn't riches. I've never been riches, never. But I feel like I made a choice. My music was getting played on BBC One radio. I was on One Extra, and I made a choice of my music career or women. And do you know what I mean? She made a choice that needed to be made, and I feel that's why I relate to her. So yes, I'd like to dedicate this performance to the Countess.
Thank you for your bravery and courage. And yeah, we like to always evoke our figurehead in terms of a spirit of resistance to gender equality. Thank you. I'll give you a handout with I Am Woman.
Thank you. This goes out to every single woman that has been before, but this specific one is for Constance. Yeah, I feel like words aren't enough, but your silence is deafening, so I call your bluff. Your quietude is deadly, my words are a bomb. Your stillness is the detonator, my words are wrong, but I still speak them, you can tell me later. Cause I don't, quite frankly, give a damn. And I am quite handy with a pen. Said I'm handy with a pen, I'm handy with a pen, and I speak my words with truth so you could try to follow me. I'll tell you it's no use, cause I can show you the way, but still you can't walk in my shoes and see my heart is pure, and so I've got nothing to lose. And I don't, quite frankly, give a damn. I'm woman, so take me as I am. Take me as I am. Shoo-doo-doo-dee-da-dee-da-die. La-da-da-dee-da-da-da-die. You know the lyrics, just sing along, it's for all of you. Words aren't enough, but your silence is deafening, so I call your bluff. Your quietude is deadly, words are a bomb. Your stillness is the detonator, my words are wrong, but I still speak them, you can tell me later. Cause I don't, quite frankly, give a damn. I'm woman, so take me as I am. Take me as I am. Shoo-doo-doo-dee-da-dee-da-die. I'll never be a man. So take me as I am, I'm woman, so take me as I am. Shoo-doo-doo-dee-da-dee-da-die. La-da-da-dee-da-da-da-die. Take me as I am, I'm woman, so take me as I am. Happy International Women's Day, everybody. I really feel like it's been today compared to last year, I don't know if everybody agrees, has been uplifting. It's always been like Valentine's Day, but for women, as opposed to what happened last year with the hijacking.
Yeah.
We're
taking it back. We're taking it back, Nahanda.
Absolutely.
Our day, and we've taken it back. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all our attendees and everyone who saw us live on Facebook. We are on YouTube. This recording will be going out on YouTube in a matter of days. And please remember to join our mailing list and join us in this movement. It's open to everybody. All you need to do is care about the rights and freedoms of women and children. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.